Okay, so hopefully this works. We'll see. We are live. It is March 15th, 2026. So keep in mind any information that we give out when it's on the recording is current as of probably an hour ago, the last time we kind of did an OSINT check. My name is Al Johnson, member of the Historical Detective Agency. Also, sometimes Mike refers to me as JBS. But what we're going to do today is kind of take a look at the question, is this World War III, or is this really kind of a longer war, right? And one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of the discussions about the war currently in Iran and actually globally is that there's a lot of confusion about intent. There's a lot of confusion about some of the kinetic measures that are going on, both at the operational and strategic level. And what we're going to do today is we're going to touch on the current events a little bit, but only so that we can dial it back and show that really there's like a longer period of time where this information matches, right? Because there's a lot of confusion. A lot of confusion. And when we really look at some other conflicts and some other things that occurred prior to this war, in a correct historical lens or a more accurate evidence-based historical lens, one of the things that you're going to notice is that now you've framed the discussion so that today's strategic moves and some of the operational moves kind of make sense, right? In other words, there's a pattern. It's just a lot of people have been taught a certain type of what I call mythery instead of history, and that kind of clouds your judgment. You become an emotional-based thinker for the most part, and then a lot of what current events occurred just don't make sense, right? It's like, why, for example, why is Trump doing this? Why are the British reticent about this? What's going on? How do the strategic things align? What the heck is, even Iran? Why are we even looking at Iran, right? All of these kind of things put together in a historical lens now begin to make a little more sense. You're like, okay, this is a pattern, right? In other words, there's a pattern in routes and resources, the same geographical terrain, as long as that resource is important, and as long as that trade route is important, is going to come up again and again, depending on whichever empire is there. So it may be Rome versus Persia. Now it is, say, the United States versus the Shanghai Cooperative Organization or Iran, which is a member of the SCO. For those of you that are kind of new on this one, what we're going to do is we're going to look more at an evidence-based approach. So kind of what I would tell people, and I do some one-on-one or some corporate clients, so to speak, or organizational clients, we'll look at it and we say at the very beginning, if you're a good person because of what you believe, and you find out that most of what you believe is a fantasy, it's just some cartoon stuff that's been made up, will you still be a good person, or are you relying on that fantasy to be a good person? If you're relying on a fantasy to be a good person, turn off now, right? Just go away, because a lot of this runs counter to the mystery that most of us grew up in. I grew up in the 70s and early 80s in the United States. At the time I was a military brat. I joined the military later, but you go very patriotic, and this is all this sort of thing. But you get a standard narrative, right? Within public education, I was in private school for a little while, but both private and public education, you get this standard narrative, and it doesn't match the fact pattern. Once you go into it and look at it with an evidence-based approach, it doesn't match. But what it does do, it may not be emotionally comforting, but what it does do is it actually makes you a little more aware of what the events are, and you can kind of get a good predictive model. So a lot of the people I've worked with, and we work back and forth on these paradigms, they look at it and they go, now the world kind of makes sense. Now this pattern is going in there, and they have a predictive model that's a little more accurate than people that are, on the old paradigm or the mystery about how wars start and what wars are. So in the beginning, we're going to a couple of ground rules, so to speak. One is if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and put them up there. This system, for whatever reason, with Substack Live, it's still not quite showing the questions, but go ahead and put them in there. It's free questions. We can go ahead and look at it and answer them. I'll answer them when I can see them, if I can see them. Hopefully they'll beam through here. I'm an investigator, not not a videographer, obviously not well polished in video presentations, but the evidence that you're going to get, feel free to look at it, examine it, take it and, come back and debate with it. Absolutely. That's what we live for, right? There's no sacred cows here. Here's the evidence. Okay, you come back with your evidence. We'll evaluate those evidence if it's contradictory, and now we'll come forward with something that might be more accurate evidence, that sort of thing. So we want to look at that. So if you're an investigator, the ABCs, right? A, assume nothing. B, believe no one, not even me. And C, confirm everything. So everything I'm telling you today, I'll give you the sources for it. go in, do your own deep dive, look at it, evaluate it, and then move forward from there. The second thing is that organizational structure dictates outcome. That's a very important concept that everyone needs to understand. As an investigator, I don't really care what, sometimes your personality, sometimes, you're telling me this, you've got great intent, but you set up an organization that is built in a certain way, there's 99% of the time it's going to have the same outcome, right? If it's a big organization that has a lot of power, that organization is going to run you down. Even if you're the head of that organization, it's going to eventually, it's going to crush you, and that organization is going to act as the organization is going to act, right? So that's the important thing, is we have to look at organizational structures and make labels for those structures that describe what they actually are, rather than slapping a label on something that's not, right? So if you take a bottle of poison, I put a wine label on it, it's not going to be a good outcome. And that's what we've done a lot in history, is we put labels on things that don't match reality. They don't match what the organizational structure is. They don't match the nature of that which we're trying to describe. They're euphemistic, and you're never going to get a good outcome with that. So as we go forward here, there's going to be terms that I use that some people may bristle at, or they don't understand it. If you do, let me know. But they're accurate. And once you get these into your head, you're going to go forward, and it's going to be a lot easier for you to kind of see things as they are. And then using those terms, come to solutions, or come to at least a better solution for how you see things, because you're looking at things accurately and you're calling it what it is. So that's very important. All right. So beginning as we stand right now, we are 2 weeks into this war. There's a lot of rumor going around. There's a lot of things I'm going to put up later. I tried to upload the video, but it won't, of my OSINT setup. I've got a large series of screens here and a number of OSINT tracking devices or tracking screens or sites that we could look at, and to try to compare information and look at information, where's the satellites go to where the bombings and hit, all that sort of thing. One of the interesting things that have come out of this, and I think most people know now because they're seeing it in real time, and there's not the ability to manage information as much on the government level as there was in the past. We had only ABC, CBS, NBC, a few sites. Now with everybody, there's all kind of information. So a lot of it is misinformation, sometimes intentional, sometimes just ignorant. Sometimes it's important data that comes through, and it's like, well, what does that indicate? So real quick, we'll look at a couple of paradoxes in the current war, and then we'll go back, we'll look at the previous wars. And once you've got the information about the accurate road to war in some previous wars that you may not have looked at before, you'll go, oh, this matches the pattern. Okay, now some of this stuff makes a little more sense. One of the anomalies that we've got is in the bombing campaign. So looking at, I think it was up to 12 days, we've got the bombing information about the targets and comparing those with the stated goals. So there's two kinetic operatives in the area that are against Iran. One is the United States, the other is Israel. And the press announcements up until some couple days ago were pretty much, hey, it's a unified front, going forward. But when you look at the targets that were being bombed by about day 2 or 3, they began to diverge, right? So in other words, it wasn't kind of a unified effort. It was a different targeting system, and not like daylight bombing or night bombing that the U.S. and Britain did, where they kind of pass things off, or you've got a better long range bomber and we'll take this because of the terrain or something like that. These appear to be on a strategic and operational level, completely different targeting. And the United States would avoid energy production, energy transmission, that sort of thing in and around Tehran, especially the fuel refineries. We weren't hitting those, and they weren't taken out initially. And then suddenly the Israelis hit those targets, and then the United States President Trump said, he kind of said that's probably not a good idea. And it makes you go, well, wait a minute, if there's a coordinated, unified effort, the U.S. should be knowing those targets. We should talk it out ahead of time and say, okay, you take this slice, we take this slice. Here's the timing, here's the coordination. And it appeared that occurred up to a certain point. But then there appeared to be, a couple of targets that were hit that caught the United States a little off guard, because it appeared as though in our bombing targeting, we weren't hitting those oil production areas or the refining areas or some of those areas. It was kind of, those were off limits, or at least they weren't being hit in this phase. And then either the Israelis jumped the gun, or they went ahead and did some independent targeting, or President Trump just made that announcement to make it look like that it's a kayfabe thing. He's making it look like there's dissension in the ranks. We don't know, but that is something to kind of take into account, is what is the production, what is the goal of the war. And when you look at what the targets were versus what the political statements were, except for the very beginning, they don't align, right? In other words, after about day 1, day 2, there's a spread. In other words, what was being said doesn't match what you're actually doing, right? And we can see that because in the very beginning, the stated goal was we have to stop the nuclear capability, right? Okay, they're close to a nuclear device. We feel that the government of Iran, this is a public statement from the United States government, the government of Iran is this, and then Israel's been saying it for I think about 20, 30 years. They're weeks away. Okay, but that's the statements that they made, and then the targets they had in the very beginning. Okay, that's part of it, but a lot of it was left intact. In other words, some of the areas are intact. You have to know you don't hit all areas because there could be contamination. There could be it's a worse condition after you hit it. You want it intact if you capture it or negotiate a transfer of some nuclear items. But you want to look at okay, well, that was the stated goal, but then very quickly it was a series of assassinations using bombs and ordnance on the Iranian leadership, and then it was the stated goal initially was we're creating a condition where the Iranian people can rise up and then they have their own government. And then the Iranian people didn't because there was enough civilian casualties and enough perspective, which matches previous wars. If you begin to bombard civilian areas, it actually hardens the resolve of the civilians against the other side, even if they didn't like their side. And we can see that World War II, big time when the first large-scale aerial bombing hit, the strategic bombing hit, the Blitz against Britain, right? When Germany shifted targets to civilians, the British resolve hardened, right? In other words, there was a lot of this and that and the other, but when that shifted, then the resolve hardened. The same when the Germans were now the targets of bombing from the British and later the Americans. Now their resolve hardens, right? And they actually become somewhat more efficient. Oddly, Spear kind of rearranged their industry, and they became more efficient the higher the bombing went. And so, bombing against civilian targets or that kind of thing sometimes backfires, right? And we had kind of a false impression based on Iraq that actually leads to a downfall. It didn't. It obviously seems at this point it may have hardened the resolve of the civilians within Iran. And we talked, if you have a chance, look about a week ago, we talked to Sargis Angari, who's an Iranian American, and he discussed some of the social mapping of people in Iran. They're not all Shia Muslims. A lot of them, there's Assyrian Christians, there's other groups, Persians, the Persian culture, the Arabic culture. So even though they're both Shia Muslim, they have different perspectives, right? So if you're Persian and you grew up and your family's long in Iran, there's a different cultural background that you have. There's a different behavior pattern that you have than, say, an Arabic or, there's Turks in there now, there's Pakistanis, he said there's coming in. So there's all different mix within Iran. It's still about 54% Persian. So I recommend you go back and look at that video to kind of get the social landscape and understand that, that the dynamics aren't as we may imagine them. Looking in from afar, they're a little bit more complicated, and how they react to each other maybe a little bit different. So that's one thing, is that the stated goals don't match the targets. And so the first stated goal, get rid of the nukes. Okay, got that. Clear the leadership so that the people can rise up. We did that. Well, that didn't work. And then we're just going to keep bombing everyone until we get a leader that we suggest, but yet we're not going to do regime change, but yet now we are. So we can see that there's a lot of different goals, and that there appear to be in some public statements from the president that we may not be aligned with our only kinetic ally right now in the moment, which is Israel, in that bombing campaign, that those targets might not have been aligned. Again, it may be kayfabe that the president just needed to make a speech for whatever reason to deceive the enemy, or it was genuine that he was kind of surprised that the Israelis hit the oil fields, right? In other words, he didn't want to hit that production yet. He wanted to keep that as kind of a leverage power. The other thing is that the spread, the Gulf states that are there. For those of you that are contractors, I'm a former, after I got out of the military, I was a contractor, security defense contractor for a little bit on counter IEDs and looking at terrorist networks, and traveled a lot. And a lot of those contracting companies, bosses, chiefs, and the big dogs like Raytheon, Booz Allen, Hamilton, all that, they were setting up kind of like principalities in the Gulf states. And the Gulf states became a magnet for investment, for technology, for, you name it. That's why you'll see some of these, they look like TED Talks, and all the industry leaders are coming to those Gulf states, because that was going to be kind of a magnet, a mecca, if you will, for this new information node that's over there. But they're competing with Saudi Arabia, who had Saudi 2030. And so you actually have tension between the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, right? It's not one big happy family. They're actually sometimes very competitive with each other. And Saudi wanted to be that central area, but most of the money was following the Gulf states. They're going up into the Gulf states. And then Jerusalem was also trying to be a hub as well. So there were three competing blocks. You had Saudi, you had the Gulf states, the principalities, so to speak, and then you had Israel wanting to be this kind of central node for this new information and financial kind of area web, the center of the web that moves out within basically what would end up being North Africa, and then the Middle East, and then moving into Central Asia. And so those three were kind of competing. Now with the retaliatory strikes by Iran, or depending how you look at it, some of them were just, smacking some of the areas for holding U.S. bases. They were hitting some of the principalities. A lot of the money that was there is moving, right? Because it's vulnerable. It's seen as it's too vulnerable as long as Iran is not aligned with the United States. That's a vulnerability. If you're a U.S. company or a U.S. aligned company or seen as a U.S. aligned company in the Gulf states, you're now vulnerable. And that strait is very, the Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz, it's very close. So the flash to bang is very quick, and a lot of the U.S. was actually blinded over there because certain critical military targets were reportedly hit, and that reduced our capability. And because of that, we had a short-sighted South Korea. We had to move THAAD missiles from South Korea over to the Middle East. And if you look at the OSINT from South Korea, a lot of the South Koreans are like, okay, so we're not defended now, right? In other words, there was a big deal about the U.S. needed to get THAAD into South Korea. It was a big political deal. We finally got the radar into South Korea. The South Koreans, pretty much had to commit. We're not going to go with China. We're going to go with America by allowing the THAAD in there, because China did not want the THAAD missiles in there because of their radar capabilities. And now the U.S. is pulling out. That's a big chatter in South Korea, and PACOM is they're moving the THAAD out of there, and the OSINT is saying that it's going over to the Middle East to protect that area. So South Korea, now we have our allies going, okay, so you don't care about us, is the threat here or not? If it's not, okay, then what are we doing with China? So that creates a big problem. Also, assets that were stationed in Sasebo in Japan, again, OSINT, all public knowledge that those are now moving over to the Middle East area. So the ability to be able to respond to Taiwan, which is, as I've said before, 80 to 90%, depending on what system you're looking at, of the silicon chips within the United States are reliant, and these are security and defense chips. 80 to 90% are reliant upon Taiwan to manufacture with TSMC. So that's a big deal. That's a very big deal, right? That's the difference between how we're living right now, talking on the internet and everything, and then the Stone Age, because we can't replace a RAM board. We can't replace a circuit board. We can't build anything new, right? So that's a big problem. Even if it gets destroyed in an invasion of Taiwan or an attack on Taiwan, that's a massive disruption, right? So that is a crown jewel until we can get, hopefully, that manufacturing base back in the United States, as it never should have left. That's a big deal. So there's a lot of geopolitical things going on. It's not just oil, even though there is a lot of oil. There's a lot of natural gas. The natural gas, people that follow Michael Young will know, that's the natural gas is a critical element of nitrogenous fertilizers. That's absolutely necessary for the high intensity farming that most of the world lives on, right? Unless you're out in Indonesia with that village that's amazing, that literally they have rice. They have a method of preserving rice, and they can't sell it. It's a sin in this village, this Indonesian village, to sell it. They've got rice for 150 to 200 years. They store it, and it's still edible. They're eating rice from like 50 to 80 years ago. And it's great. I'd recommend, if it's secure, go to this village, take a look at it. And they do it all natural. It's all organic. There's no machines. It's all by hand. The village is organized. It's remarkable. They've got food resilience. But unless you're living like that, you rely upon high intensity farming with with fertilizers, right? Nitrogenous-based fertilizers, which comes from natural gas. And if that's gone, then the fertilizers, your farm feeds, right? And it's everything. It's cascading, right? So you've got your grains, your cereals, and that feeds the pigs, the chickens, the cows. Then you don't have beef, you don't have protein, right? So you have massive nutritional deficiencies, caloric deficiencies. I mean, it's famine, right? In other words, if that goes out, there's oil is one thing, which is part of this spectrum of materials that are now being slowly turned off, is one thing, but natural gas is another big one, right? It's part of your agricultural necessity in a modern world. That's going to go down, and that's famine. The other part is people don't realize this, helium, right? Helium comes out of some of the Gulf states produce helium, up to 30% of the supply, depending on when you look at it, that moves over into places like TSMC and elsewhere that make those chips. And if the 30% drop in the ability of TSMC to get helium, they're going to have to reduce production, right, 30%, or find another supplier, which there's not many. Helium's doesn't grow on trees, not like hydrogen, right? Doesn't come from the water. Helium's a lot more scarce. And the problem is that, okay, the availability goes down, the prices go up, And again, you begin to set those costs in there, and then what is going to happen? Food's going to go up, right? Cost, everything is connected. So if one cost goes up, everything goes up. So it's not just oil, natural gas, helium, other areas in there. We also have to look at different sources. So just those three, I'm not going to complicate it, but just those three coming out of there, if that starts to get squeezed, that creates a problem. The other thing is another, if you're looking at OSIN, I want to give this to you guys before I go back into the history. There's pronouncements, political pronouncements. They're there to sell it. Got it. Right. That's their job, is to sell, their nation and their investors on, okay, we're doing great. But for the reality about what might be going on in the Gulf, if it's actually returning to normal, or if it's stabilizing, or if we still got a problem with the throughput, look at the insurance rates, right? So like Lloyd's of London, look at the insurance rates, and if it goes up or down. Insurance rates are actually pretty good about understanding flows. And so if you see the shipping insurance rates go up and they stay up, well, it's not really stabilized yet, no matter what somebody says. Right? They're trying to drive those rates down. Those rates are up there. They're going to stay up there. It's still pretty volatile, no matter who's saying what. So I recommend go back and kind of look at those indicators to kind of get a better feel for what's going on. Now, going forward in the future, who knows? But there is a potential of a cascading effect. The other thing is everybody's talking about the depletion of the availability of the Iranians to field some of these systems, these drones and missile systems going forward. It's not just self-production, as I've said for good grief, over 10 years, maybe 15 years. In fact, I argued with an MI5 guy about it because I couldn't believe he didn't understand it 12 years ago, 13 years ago, that there's something called the SCO, and you need to be familiar with it. It's the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, right? And when Ukraine hit, then people kind of realized it, because they're like, why is China supplying Russia? Well, because they've been Russia's ally since 1995, right? With the Shanghai Five, which was Russia getting together with China and then a couple of other nations to create an internal axis, basically. So finance, information, trade, defense. They do joint exercise. They used to do joint exercises just about every year, large exercises, Russia, China, and then the other SCO allies in there. And at one point, it was like 21 nations were kind of coming to this thing to share information, security, intelligence, to create the framework where they could kind of support one another in the event of conflict. And in 1995, it was literally formed to go against the United States. I mean, that's what they did, because they didn't want it hegemonic, because Russia had collapsed, and they kind of reached out to China. And they said, okay, we got to pool our resources together. And China wanted to, because they saw the technological advance that the U.S. had in the first Gulf War, Desert Storm. And they said, okay, we're going to need allies in this thing until they can get to the point where they have the technical and superior dominance over the United States, and then move forward. So that's part of this calculus, is that you have to realize that Iran is part of the SCO. They're a signature to the SCO. They're part of the SCO, and that there are internal lines of communication via Pakistan, who's another member of the SCO, to China overland, right? So they can move this through. The Belt and Road has been set up along old lines, right? It was old Silk Road, but even there's more of those now. Little Silk Roads of the Belt and Road Initiative. And those are old Persian lines. I mean, Persia, which is Iran, those lines are there. That's what Alexander the Great crossed all the way into India, was those old Persian roads. We marvel at the Roman roads. The Persians had very similar, and their empire that went all the way down at times into Egypt, both the Assyrians and the Persians. So these lines are a lot more than we think. We see a line on a map, but sometimes that's just political. It's very easy to, and there's lots of little trade routes all through there. And that's what's being used. And China has and will, and probably will continue to supply materials to Iran, as they have done also with Russia. So the ability of us to degrade that is there, but it won't shut the spigot off unless you shut off the ability for the Chinese to kind of resupply them over land in an internal line of control. We'd have to get up into Pakistan and over there. And as anyone who was in Afghanistan knows, you can't really shut anything out of those areas through Pakistan, right? It's kind of spongy. So that's kind of what we have to look at as we go forward. So that's kind of the broad overview of what's happening now and how it's volatile and how some things are connected. The targets don't make sense. What's going on? Why would we want the Gulf states to get hit? Why would we put them in that position? But looking at going back in history, how wars were planned, what wars did, what the United States did, a lot of wars, when you begin to look at it, don't make sense from a national perspective. I hear a lot of people say, and I'm the same way. I'm like, what are we doing there, right? So why go there? And it won't make sense from a national perspective as an American voter, an American citizen, but it makes sense if you're an oligarch and America is within your portfolio, that you can use this tool to leverage and get an economic benefit. Now that sounds crazy. It sounds far afield, but it does exist. And we're going to go over some of that right now. The first thing that we're going to go to is we're going to look at what we talked about before. If you can go on to some of, actually, when I was in Panama, I visited Michael Young for a bit. He said, come down, take a look at this. And it was like, wow. And I did the history of, Panama. I began to look at it, and there's a couple of excellent sources that were there. I definitely recommend The Path Between the Seas, about the history of the Panama Canal. And, it's a flag waving patriotic, hey, we're great, but it even admits, and it shows the documentation, and there's others that we've looked at beyond that, but that's a good primer that talks about the United States literally created the nation of Panama, and were willing to violate the international treaty we had with Colombia to protect them and to protect the railroad that we had there initially, in order to get profit for a handful of folks. Literally, we were about to go to war with Colombia, violate international treaty, and we fomented a revolution. And corporate guys did it, right? So the corporate guys set up a revolution, basically a lawyer. There was a guy named Cromwell, William J. Cromwell, who his clients were, and how did he have so much power? How could a lawyer in New York have so much power over Washington that he literally not only moved the United States from, we were going to build a canal in Nicaragua, which we already kind of had the plan to do, but we're going to take over the very dangerous and disastrous for the French Panama Canal plan. And in order to do that, we're going to have to create this new nation of Panama so that we don't even have to pay $10 million to Colombia. To save $10 million to Colombia and maximize profit, we're going to go to war rather than just wait it out and sign a treaty. That's the level. So how does a lawyer do this? Well, very simply, you look at just two of his clients. And again, William J. Cromwell and Sullivan Law Firm, they're still around. Guys like Peter Thiel actually went there. I mean, there's a lot, you look at their Supreme Court justices in there, there's Supreme Court justices or chief justices of other nations that have been there. Their alumni are very interesting. They're still there. The Dulles brothers, right? Remember them from the CIA and the State Department, right? They're alumni of Cromwell and Sullivan, right? They were formed there early. The Dulles, of course, was the nephews of the Lansing, who was Secretary of State under Wilson, right? But in a nutshell, without complicating it too much, William Cromwell, the lawyer of Sullivan and Cromwell, so William J. Cromwell, two of his clients were, of course, Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, right? So you have 90% of the entire oil distribution, production, extraction in the United States, right? 90%. It's the lifeblood at that time as we're beginning to industrialize. And then J.P. Morgan, who's got a massive amount of investments, resources, U.S. Steel. I mean, he's got everything in banking, right? J.P. Morgan Chase. That's as two clients. So that's how this lawyer could walk into the president's office. Literally, I'm going to go see the president. He could walk into the president's office and go, my clients want this. This is kind of what we're looking for. And there's a clear line where that actually occurred, and it shaped the United States to go, like I said, shift from Nicaragua, which would have been an easy engineering project, to Panama, which was very difficult. And we got very lucky, almost a miracle, because there was a doctor that figured out, a U.S. doctor that had been in Cuba and tropical areas. He was from the South, so he knew. He was the one that said, "Hey, I believe that the malaria vector and the yellow fever vector come from mosquitoes." And he identified the two types of mosquitoes, the two things that you need to do, because they both behave differently, to mitigate that. And then that's why we didn't have casualties on par with the French when we built our section of the canal. But very important. Put up in 1914, very important, because we needed this geostrategic for the next couple of wars, but we needed that canal. The canal becomes very important for the United States to survive economically and expand as an empire. And it's just the way it is. So that will always be a main geofocal point for the United States. The British, why is the Middle East so important? And Israel kind of has its place in there. The British is similar with the Suez Canal. The French built the Suez Canal, but the British were like, oh, heck no. There's no way the French are going to control this thing, right? Which there's also some British help collusion, looks like, with the United States and being able to take over the French concern, because they didn't want anybody else to make an alternate canal if we'd made ours in Nicaragua. But going back to the Suez Canal, French built the Suez Canal. The British came in and took shares, controlling shares of the corporation, and then said, well, that's not enough. We're going to annex Egypt. So they grabbed Egypt, they bankrupted Egypt, and then they took it. So they colonized, occupied Egypt so they could secure the canal. But now they're looking at the western flank, right? And the western flank was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was getting friendly with, guess who? Kaiser Wilhelm II, right? They had a pretty good relationship. They had one a little bit before. The German General Staff actually went to the Ottomans to figure out, okay, how do we kind of construct this new national army of the Germans, right? Because Germany became 1871. And fast forward here, we're now late 1870s, 1880s. they begin to come up with this idea that they needed a population. And the British did this in India. They do it all over the place. Russians do it. A lot of empires do this. They'll move populations around outside of their area in order to kind of control, right? So populations conflict, and that helps, right? Divide and conquer, right? As long as you guys are fighting you're not going to pay attention to me that much. I'll come in and get what I need done. Nice distraction. So they actually were the ones that created the modern sense of Zionism, and it was a British, basically a British company. They sold shares. They did a whole thing. It's like carbon credits. It was kind of crazy. You were going to sell, and they sold this idea to Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was looking at this, all the Jews in Austria-Hungary is where he's from, and he was like, well, maybe we should just do a big public conversion to Christianity in the big cathedral in Vienna, and then people will leave us alone. That was his idea at first, and then after meeting some folks from the Oliphant group, which was over from Britain, they were the Zionists that wanted this kind of to go. They approached him. Now, why did they approach Theodor Herzl? Well, one of the promoters of the political Zionism, the dispensationalism, which was created in England, he was a guy named Oliphant. He had actually gone over to Palestine, the Ottoman Palestine. He tried to set up little communes, right? And Jews would come. He's like, great, we're going to buy this land. We're going to do it all, right? He talked to Rothschild. He's like, hey, buy some land. Let's get this going, right? He's getting moving the money around, and it didn't work because back then, no Jew wanted to go to Palestine unless you're wanting to go to the patriarch's tomb, or there's a couple of yeshivas there. There had always been Jews in Palestine forever, right? We were never kicked out of Palestine. The Romans never kicked the Jews completely out. It was only the leadership and the rebellious group after the Bar Kokhba revolt. So there was always a Jewish presence there, and you could always buy land. Well, Oliphant, it didn't work, right? No Jew wanted to go there. Those days, you go to Berlin, you go to Vienna, or you go to New York, right? and if when you went to Berlin and you're from Russia, usually the German Jews are like, yeah, keep going to New York. Here, I'll pay your fare, like Albert Ballin did. But they created that, and they needed that buffer state, basically, right? And so that's what they were looking at. So they approached Theodor Herzl. They said, okay, it's going to have to be a Jewish guy that leads this thing. They convinced Theodor Herzl. He wrote about it. It's in his books. Alt-Neuland is kind of the novel about how he came to this decision and decided on not Brazil, but Palestine. And then it goes into how he was kind of recruited. And then he had the Judenstaat, which is the Jewish state. And he goes into, this is a corporation. There's two corporations we set up. This is how we do it. It's going to be chartered in London, right? So it's a London corporation, much like the East India Tea Company, you name it. There it is. And then you're going to sell your land. You're going to sell your property. This is in his book. You're going to sell your property to this British corporation. And then you're going to get a credit when you move over to Palestine. And then they're going to sell that to the Christians in there. But essentially, it's a wealth transfer to Britain. Britain controls both Europe, and now they've got this population they believed would be beholden to them, and move forward. Flash forward to 1956, Britain calls in its mark and says, hey, Egypt just nationalized the canal. All right, Israel, you invade, and me, Britain, and France are going to parachute in and guard the canal. It's the 1956 Suez Crisis, right? But Eisenhower was not on board with that, and so he put a kibosh on it. But that was some of the plans. Egypt was nationalized. It Nasser had nationalized. He said, look, this is an Egyptian canal. We had it at the beginning, right? It's supposed to be 50% ours. Shenanigans got it out of our hands. It's now going to be ours. At the same time that Iran was nationalizing the oil that was British oil. And so the British said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Israel, you invade, right? That's the casus belli for us and France to go in. So it doesn't look like we're going in to do the canal. We're going in to separate you two people, right? We're going in to make peace between Israel and Egypt, but we're going to sit in the canal. We're going to create this buffer zone right here. But de facto, they hold the canal. And again, all of this is declassified. You can take a look at it. 1956 Suez Crisis, the U.S. State Department, where we were intercepting all of that information. And Eisenhower said, no, it's not going to work. So he said, Britain, France, go home, Israel back up, right? So that solved that problem for the time being. But it shows the dynamics, right? So everyone else sees that, oh my gosh, Israel and Egypt are going to war. Oh, this is terrible. But the reality was it was Britain and France colluding with Israel because they're calling in their mark and they're going, hey, let's do this. And so there's a lot of showmanship that goes on within wars ahead of time, but it's economic. Britain wanted that canal. They wanted to own that canal, control the canal, get the revenue from the canal, and the intelligence of canals. There's another part we'll go into much later. Actually, you can take a look over at Michael Yawn's site about intelligence that comes through on canal. And there's a bunch of guys like Conrad and all that. I mean, they know shipping far better than anybody I've ever even heard. And they can go through and they'll tell you why just a little bit of information about what's going through a canal and when and what the transit time is can translate to millions of dollars on speculation markets and things like that. So there's a lot of money involved in canals. So that was very important. So That's known. That's one example of a war. The other one is, let's back up a little bit to World War I in Britain. Most people believe that World War I was, the Archduke Ferdinand gets shot, and because of all these secret treaties, everybody just stumbled and bumbled into World War I. However, what most people don't realize is there was an oligarchical structure that was similar to Rockefeller. In fact, it was bigger than Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan in America, that was at play in Britain and created not just World War I, but we'll back up a little bit to the Boer War. And it was probably a name you may associate. You've probably all heard of Rhodes, right? There's a Rhodes Scholarship, Rhodes Academy, all that sort of thing. But his name was Cecil Rhodes, and he was kind of a combination of like a Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, all that. In fact, he was South African, right? So Cecil Rhodes was a bazillionaire, basically, in those days. He was a bazillionaire, right? Phenomenal wealth from diamonds in South Africa, from trade. I mean, he had a tremendous amount of resources, and he was fixated on Africa. So he had a couple of goals. One of his goals was basically to link South Africa all the way up to Egypt, right? So the British would now own the spine of Africa, and therefore all trade, everything goes through that. Routes and resources, you're going to own the spine of Africa, and therefore you control Africa. It doesn't matter if France is there, or Italy's there, or Germany's there. We've got it, right? The British have it. And that was his first idea. The second thing that he came up with, and this was in his will, he publishes his will openly, right? This was in a day when oligarchs weren't seen as bad, and having these kind of schemes wasn't, oh, this is a plot to take over the world, or conspiracy, right? This was, hey, this is what I'm doing for England. This is great. I'm a good patriot. Check it out. So he, with all his bazillions of dollars, is going to leave it to a foundation and say, I'm going to create this clique, and you were going to go forward. But what I want is a bunch of things. There's like five main things, but among them is something that's very important for how we see things here. Number one, he said that the United States must come back into the British family of nations. He was very serious about that, right? Because the United States was autarkic. In other words, we had everything we need within the United States, right? But he wants them aligned with Britain. He wants it back under this kind of British oligarchical control, at least for where resources go, who do we go to war with, and all this sort of thing, right? It's a very powerful ally. It needs to come back into the British family, right, of commonwealths, basically a puppet state. So he works very hard at that. And that's why Rhodes Scholarships, a lot of exchanges began to occur. There's the Pilgrim Society. There was all these little social clubs that sprang up in Boston, New York, and the East Coast cities, Chicago. You'll see a lot of these were founded by Rhodes to get this social integration, right? To kind of get these folks in here, move Americans over, create Anglophiles out of them versus Anglophobes, which we had been because we fought against them, and we had still this, anti-colonial bent in the 1880s, 1890s. And so he began to transform the culture and the perception of the important Americans, right? Because he recognized, I don't need to convince all of them. I just need to convince the right ones that can then convince the rest of them, right? And that's a theme you'll see elsewhere, and it continues on, very important. And so he did that. And so over time, he begins to get the elite, or I hate to use the word elite, the ruling class. He begins to kind of get those guys more aligned with kind of a British perspective than anything else, which is interesting because at that time in the 1880s, the largest immigrant group within the Americans was actually Germanic, right? So Germany formed in 1871. A lot of them came over earlier. So you're Thuringian or Bavarian or, Württembergian or Prussian, but essentially German. Your culture, your language follows along what we would associate with German. That was the majority of migrants to America, especially in the North and the Midwest, was the German group. And so the British, Cecil Rhodes specifically, felt that that was a vulnerability and a danger, right? Because they may have affinity for Germany because of what he said next. His number two thing after getting America into the fold was Germany must die. Like Rome, like Carthage must die. He was very much Germany must die. And this is in the late 1880s, early 1890s. Why? What did Germany do, right? What the heck? They just formed up in 1871. What threat do they have? I mean, Britain has 2/3 of the world, of the biggest navy. How is this even a threat? It was an economic threat, right? Because the British were unable to compete on a purely qualitative and quantitative level with German industry at that time. And so it was basically competitors. Albert Bollin, a Jewish German, actually had created the Hamburg-America shipping line, which later became Hapag and then Hapag-Lloyd. But basically that was giving Britain a run for their money in passenger and cargo service, initially in the Atlantic, and then it was starting to go global. So that was a big deal for the British. You can't have that line of communication and trade. That's got to stay in Britain. But the only way they could do it, they couldn't outproduce it. They're going to go bankrupt. The only way they could do it was wipe out Germany. So he, early in the 1890s, came to that, put it in his document, his will, and says, this is what we're going to do. And he began to associate other oligarchs around him that would facilitate this going forward. And a lot of names that you'll definitely remember going forward. One of the things that he had to do is up in the orange, and if you look at South Africa, Britain had the coastline, and late 1880s, early 1890s, you had the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And so those were Boers, those were Dutch that came down and they had their area. Well, they found gold, and a lot of gold. Also, if you go back to Historical Detective Agency, you'll see that there's 3 silver things, the Wizard of Oz. There's the silver lining of the Wizard of Oz. The gunfight at the OK Corral was actually about silver shipments. And then also the Silver Samurai, about how Sengoku Jidai and then the subsequent closure of Japan to the west was actually in large part by massive findings of silver. So a massive find of resources tends to drive a war, but you can't really say we're going for this. So what did he do? We're going for this resource, right? Who's going to fight and die for that? You fight and die for emotional things, right? Unless you're Kelly's Heroes, which is more of an honest, fight in that case. Okay, that's what we're fighting for. Just give me a cut of it, right? That's what kind of it boils down to. And you'll see it. So in the Boer War, what they began to do was they first did a Jameson raid. And there's a guy named Jameson, Jameson's whiskey, but the Jameson raid was a complete failure. And at that point, Cecil Rhodes almost got arrested, right? There's a big parliament was screaming, what are we doing? How dare we try to set up a revolution in the Orange Free State and the Transvaal with this? This is bad. So people in his group realized that, okay, Cecil Rhodes is a little too aggressive. He's a little too verbal. He's a little too fast. We need an organizer. And they got a guy named Alfred Milner. Look this up. You probably never heard of him, but he was probably the most powerful man, arguably, of the last 2 centuries. Alfred Milner. He was an organizational genius. Organizational structure dictates outcome. He was the guy that went through and was able to look at all of this information and go, okay, this is what we have. This is what we have to do. He got the Times of London, right? The Times. He says, I don't have to buy the whole paper. I just need to buy an editor and a couple of reporters. That's it. And I'll get these stories through, right? So on the org chart, it's still owned by people outside, but he's got the people, the folks leveraging in power. He understood how to get the nodes of power, where that organizational structure works. What do I have to capture with the minimal amount of investment to secure it and then move my program forward? So the Times would always broadcast whatever the heck he wanted to. So if you wanted to know what England was going to do next, read the Times, right? And that pattern continues. There's certain informational outlets that are more propagandists or trial balloons for oligarch groups that move government than they are actual news organizations, right? They're corporate disinformation outlets. That's all they are. So he had the Times and he would move that. And so the Times went back to that whole plan about let's get the Orange Free State and Transvaal. We need those gold mines. We got to get the Dutch out of there, the Boers. And they began to develop atrocities against the British miners that were up there. Oh my God, they were just all kind of atrocities. They got the public opinion of the Brits that were like, how dare they abuse us? We go up there to help them mine and they're abusing us and doing all horrible things. Just the big atrocity porn, basically, to get the justification for basically was hostile takeover with using British guns. And so Kirchner was the guy, Lord Kirchner went there. Oddly, he was also the guy that they picked when he was a lieutenant about 20 years before. He was mapping Palestine. It was still Ottoman. The British hadn't even gotten Egypt yet. They got the canal, but they hadn't gotten Egypt. And so he's over there with a massively detailed map of Palestine, where eventually Israel will go. I mean, Kirchner and a couple other guys were just mapping everything from a wells. I mean, if there was a well, if there was a wadi, if there was like a small village, they would map it. They had the names of it in Arabic, the phonetic, and then if there's 2 different groups like the Jews and the Arabs, or some Assyrians were still there, they would sit there, Turks, and they would have the different names with the phonetics. It is a remarkable database that he did with mapping and the charts. It's perfect. Like it's amazing. But why would the British do that much? Because they're forecasting they're going to go in there, right? So when you do surveys like satellite passes and things like that nowadays, okay, there may be some kinetic movement beyond that. So just keep that in mind. So anyway, Alfred Milner comes in. Long story short, they get the gold mines, right? But the Boer War is a lot more involved and brutal than they thought. They thought it would be a pushover, and the Boers just bloodied the heck out of them, right? So eventually that's where Churchill gets part of his legend is there. They kind of move him up. They propagandize him to kind of move him up because he's a connection to America. His mom's American, so they work on this sort of thing. But it's a lot more brutal than they think, which kind of saves them when World War I hits. And that sort of thing. Oh, hey, we got a question here. Hang on just a second. We're going to push this through. There's so much emotion propaganda throughout history. How does one find simply the facts? That's actually a good one from Black Wolf. She was there last week, I think. A couple things that, one is when we're looking at these, like we're taking this, You have to go evidence-based versus emotional-based. The emotional base for most people is like, wow, that's a great deal for Britain, and look what we did. And this is amazing for America. We're about to hit, we're next. We'll get to this history, World War II. Looking at the facts, what supports it, and the other thing that's very important is what I call the MMO, means motive opportunity. Right? Everybody at some point has a motive. Every 14-year-old kid, every 8-year-old kid in a playground some points like, I'm king of the world, right? Or he looks over across the playground at the cute girl and he's like, I'm going to marry Mary Sue. So he's got motive, right? But does he have the means, and does he have the opportunity, right? And that's what most people miss out on, is the means and opportunity. They'll look at a statement, they'll look at something written by somebody, they'll look at something and think that's the evidence I need because they had a motive, or we assume they have a motive. They may not even have the motive. We just think they have a motive. But you have to have the means, right? The ability to be able to do what you say, and the opportunity. In the case of the oligarchies we described with Cromwell and Sullivan, right? So William Cromwell, that created the nation of Panama for his clients and used the United States government to do it. How did he have the means to do it, right? Could any lawyer just walk in and talk to Taft and Roosevelt? No, of course not, right? That's ridiculous. How does he have the means? Well, he has the means by the connections. He has the means because Rockefeller and JP Morgan are his clients, right? He has a lot of money and they fund a lot of campaigns, right? So he's collected in there. He's the one that was able to structure, most of the huge industrial concerns in the United States and protect them from antitrust laws. In fact, there's some evidence of collusion where that just wipes out competition and the big boys still own their stuff. Look at Standard Oil with Rockefeller. That's the means, right? Alfred Milner, Cecil Rhodes had the means. They had tremendous wealth, but wealth alone doesn't give you power. They had the nodes of power. Alfred Milner had members of the royals on board, right? Once Queen Victoria died, Victoria was totally against it. She was like, let's have this Victorian ideal where Europe is all related to her, and it's Pax Victoria, really. It was a goal of peace through relationships and kind of the monarchies that are intertwined, and then kind of a civilizing aspect. And that was Victoria, but these guys were like, Germany must die, right? And that was her favorite grandson, was Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Kaiser Wilhelm II just adored Victoria. So you're never going to it's very hard to get a war between that until she died, and then they had co-opted the son. But going back to your question, you have to find emotional propaganda. You're going to have to subsume that, and that's for historical investigations and regular investigations, is evidence-based approach. Even if you have this idea of self, right? I'm an American. I'm very proud of my, the service, join the military, right? It was like, hey, patriotic. But if something happens that's wrong, okay, it happened, right? Doesn't matter, right? If I have a client and he's like, okay, I need you to investigate X, Y, and Z. Well, these are the facts. Your wife did this. Your father's not your father. Here's the actual, information that that occurred that you didn't have. He's not your dad. That sort of thing. Those are the facts. You're still you, right? You control you. You're that person. The problem is we identify ourselves. We try to create these totems around us to create an identity of something that we're not. Right? This is who I am. All of this is okay. That happened in the past, but am I now that? No. Right? That's something I did in the past. Who am I? I'm Al Johnson. I'm an investigator. This is the role I have, and I'm composed of that. And the more people can kind of become centered on that aspect of it, right? You don't have to latch on to other things and other myths and all that. The more you reduce the emotional dependency on sense of self onto something that you can't control and that controls you, that's important, right? And that lends you then, okay, I'm just going to go for the facts. Doesn't change who I am. I'm not a bad person, or some days I can be if I'm upset. But that's the whole point of the thing, is that you have to reduce that, become evidence-based as opposed to emotional-based in your research. And that's very difficult for people to do, because somehow they assume that they're part of this thing, especially in history. They assign themselves to it. You'll hear people say, we fought, even me, I'll say, we fought World War II. I wasn't even born in World War II. I didn't fight World War II. Right. And it doesn't take away from the people that fought it, because they were fighting for what they were fighting for. Some of them were fighting for, to oppress a girlfriend. They join up and they enlist. Some people were fighting for, they honestly believed that they were doing was protecting their homeland. Some people join up because economically they couldn't do it. Right. Did they do the job? Yeah, they did it. But the motives are all over the place. Right. But why was the war being fought at a national level or an international level? Completely different. But it doesn't change the fact of what the individual motivation was of the soldier, the sailor, the Marines, the airmen, now the spacemen going through it. They still fought for their reasons, and we have to recognize that. We have to separate it. We try to create these giant blocks that don't exist. It's very complicated, but once you kind of look at it that way, it becomes very simple. So actually, it's a good question. Thank you. So going back, Cecil Rhodes, they had the motive, they had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. The motive we know because they wrote it. It's like the charter, right? The money is only going to be used for this. We know Rockefeller's motive, right? When he created the largest, what I consider so far, the largest provable oligarchy that I've seen, which is Rockefeller, because he creates the Rockefeller Foundation. And in the charter of the foundation, he's very clear. Where he puts his money is very clear. There is definitely a trend in there. Population reduction, control of medicine. I mean, he's open about it, right? I mean, it's just didn't make a problem with it. And then he wouldn't give money to his kids unless they were part of the foundation, and then they were moving the foundation goals. Then you get a little bit of money. Then you get a little bit of a stipend, but you're not just getting it because you're my kid. You're getting it because you're carrying forward the ideals that Rockefeller had. So those are organization, right? So a lot of people come along going, I'm going to take over the world. I want to reduce the population. Okay, but what do you actually own, and or who are you able to maneuver and manipulate, and that sort of thing. So keep that in mind. So we see that they took over the gold mines. They had a whole bunch more gold coming in. They were able to kind of maneuver this around. Rothschild was part of the Alfred Milner Cecil Rhodes network, right? In other words, he was a component of it. He wasn't the whole thing, right? In fact, the only Rothschild that ever became chairman of the Bank of England lasted only a few months, and then he got voted out, right? So, and even though he had supported Oliphant, initially setting up colonies there, and then he was able to kind of lend his name to the initial Balfour Declaration, right, which was already there. The framework was there. Balfour did not start the clock for British using of Zionism as colonization. That was actually 20 years after they'd already tried other things and got things moving, right? They'd already kind of groomed Theodore Herzl and pushed him in the way that he was going to go. That was more, wartime kind of exigencies that they needed to do. And oh, by the way, they promised that same land to 3 other groups. Right? The French, the Arabs, and the Jews. They promised that same land to 3 groups in the middle of a war. Right? And then afterward, by the way, there was a number of Rothschilds that actually created an anti-Zionist group because they recognized that, a lot of the motivation is to push all the Jews out of Europe and into a sandbox, and they felt they would be part of it, right? Their assets would be seized and they would be part of that. So keep that in mind. Also, looking at that, you have to see the organizational structure. So Alfred Milner, very, very good organizer, I mean, genius. Cecil Rhodes, he's the money guy, but they had other guys. Lord Earl Grey, eventually Winston Churchill was part of it. They had King Edward, the King George was in there, King Edward. Interestingly, they were able to use Epstein-like tactics where they actually took the King of England when he was a prince to France. Now, remember, Britain and France hated each other. So they took him over there. There was actually a brothel, still bears the king's name today. They had special, because he was a big guy, they had special beds. It's kind of not quite conversational material here, but let's just say that it was, they were able to get ladies of the evening into him. And through that emotional and blackmail process, they forged his connection to France, which superseded the British, saying we, traditionally our historical enemy has been France, right? And then we're related more to the Germans than we are to the French because Kaiser Wilhelm II is the grandson of Queen Victoria, her favorite. But once she died, he's now the king, and they've got him, right? So they pretty much own the monarchy at that point, right? So Alfred Milner can, knock in the door of Buckingham Palace and go, hey, maybe we want to go this way. Maybe we should do France that way. So there's a long road in there. And then the attempts for World War I, the British had actually a very good plan because of the brutality that occurred during the Boer War, because of the huge casualties that occurred during the Boer War. They knew they couldn't do a land war. Even with everything they had, they weren't good at land war by themselves. So what do? They say, okay, France was chomping at the bit to get revenge on Germany for 1871. Of course, the Franco-Prussian War, Germany had gotten Alsace-Lorraine, and the French wanted it back. Right, that was a big deal. So they didn't take a lot of convincing. They took convincing that hey, the Brits are not going to betray us, to invade us afterward. So they worked those lines through. They actually had Belgium. There were actually storehouses in Belgium where they had forward supplied areas because they were going to move up through Belgium. The French and the British were going to move up through Belgium, mostly the French, British Expeditionary Force, small amount, and they were going to move up and then into Germany at the same time. And this was key. They had to get Russia on board, right? Because Russia had the 10 million men army. I mean, it was massive, right? This giant, it's right above Germany. And the Tsar and the Kaiser were good friends. They're cousins. They're great friends, actually. So they go hunting together. They go yachting. Families go for summer meetings. But Britain is able to leverage, the people in the staff, the foreign secretary. There's a huge thing there. We'll probably do something separate on that, just with the names and everything in the timeline. But now Russia's on board, and that actually involved the Russo-Japanese War to demolish the Russians, to get them to the point where Britain comes in and goes, I've got loans and ships now since you need to rebuild. And then they go on board with a scheme. But basically, World War I was supposed to be the Russians invade through Prussia, shoot into Königsberg and then down into Berlin. Meanwhile, the French are going to move up as a pincer movement, right, through from the south through Belgium, and then march on Berlin and then just crush Berlin by Christmas. Remember that it's over by Christmas, so that's kind of the plan. Over by Christmas, they just needed a casus belli, right? I mean, this has been destroyed. Germany's been baked into their DNA since late 1880s, early 1890s. They have America on board now. There's some agreements with America. They've intertwined economies with America now. They've got us set up. They got us on a central bank. I mean, this is nuts. So there's a lot of things going on there. But one of the things that's interesting is that they tried in 1910 to have a war. They were trying as hard as they could to trigger a war, casus belli, with Imperial Germany. And the Kaiser Wilhelm, despite all of his costumes and everything, his penchant for military parades and dressing up, he was actually a pacifist. He actually did not want to go to war. He was not big on it. He would in for example, the Boxer Rebellion, as part of the multinational force that went over there. He was like, yeah, let's go over there and get it, right? That was one, but it was with everybody else. He didn't want to act in anything that was against England's interest as much as he could. Now, he wanted parity, but he didn't want to kind of go to war with them. And so he was avoiding any conflict anything that would lead to conflict with Britain as much as he could, except on the naval issue. But that was civilian naval, and then the military to kind of guard his outposts in that. It wasn't a head-to-head competition. And he was never going to gain parity numbers-wise with the British. That was impossible for the next 20, 30 years, probably. But they tried 1910, 1911, a lot of pressure, just never happened. And then that's when the Serbian crisis hit. And that was now the casus belli, because the alignment between Germany and Austro-Hungary. So they push that. There's a significant amount of evidence that the language that the Serbian rebuttal to the Austro-Hungarian demand that they investigate this was actually in the language. It's the language of Lord Earl Grey, right? It's not a Serbian language. Doesn't match any Serbian historical. It's just this anomaly that comes up. So there's some strong evidence that the British crafted the response to just be diplomatic enough, but enough to punch the nose of the ego of the Austro-Hungarians so that they would have to go kinetic. That would drag Germany in. Russia mobilized first. The British had mobilized the fleet during the King's Review with military ordnance on board. So they had war loads already ready. They stayed at anchor. It was a huge parade for the king with all the fleet. They didn't demob, right? And this is before the crisis. So they're there. They've mobilized, effectively, they mobilized the Navy. They just covered it under a review. And France is chomping at the bit. They mobilized. Germany was like the last to mobilize. And then by a miracle with Ludendorff and Hindenburg, they beat the Russians back in the Masurian Lakes area, which is Tannenberg, and they pushed them all the way back to Warsaw. And eventually the Russians were knocked out of the war by the Germans, right? So people wonder in World War II, why'd you invade the Russia? Well, because they beat them in the first war handily, right? It's like, yeah, that was the easy one. France was the hard one, right? And that reversed in World War II. So keep that in mind, that Russia has been defeated, not just by the Mongols, but by the Germans in World War I. We just don't study it. But that's the motive. The motive is economic. The motive was to knock out Germany as a competitor. Now, the problem is they thought it would be over by Christmas. They thought it was a brilliant plan. The French and the Russians would do the heavy lifting. The problem was it didn't go according to plan. Even after 32 nations were fighting against Imperial Germany, and they're holding up the Austro-Hungarians. The Italians flipped sides. They're now on the Entente side against Germany and Austro-Hungary. And it was just brutal. It was just a brutal slog. And then the British had to start drafting and moving their folks in there. They needed the Americans in there, right, for industrial stuff. And that's when we did the little flip and we said, okay, we're going to get some of that. Our oligarchs said, we're going to do it. They didn't finish paying off those debts until the 2000s from World War I. We owned a lot of their assets, right? So a lot of it was assets. A lot of it was economics. Had nothing to do with the Archduke Ferdinand. I mean, royals got assassinated left, right, and center all the time. Doesn't create a world war. It's just the reason that they need to sell the public on it, right? And it was very much, a lot of people made a lot of money off that war from a lot of blood. But the plan didn't go according to plan. Britain was supposed to come out on top, and they actually were hurting pretty bad economically. And the U.S. now was holding those debt cards. So we had a little bit of leverage after that. But it didn't really matter to Alfred Milner and Cecil Rhodes, because they had now economically entwined themselves to a lot of the American oligarch system. So if America profited, the American oligarchs profit, they profit. And once Cecil Rhodes dies and some of that first generation kind of dies off, a lot of them weren't as patriotic for Britain as they were. And that's another thing that we need to understand about oligarchs. They will use the country that they're in. They'll wave the flag. They say, oh, it's great. They'll use that country to make their portfolios bigger. They don't care, right? They'll even destroy an entire country, just move to the next. It's just seen as a corporate structure for them. A nation for them, for a lot of guys at the top, when you read what they're writing, that's why they like this, I'm a citizen of the world, or I'm a global citizen. is because they don't care about the system. That's just a corporation. It's old. I don't like this country. We're going to clear the books and I'm going to go somewhere else, right? Same as they do with dissolving companies. They'll dissolve a corporation as long as they have a means to be able to transfer their wealth and power somewhere else, or it's already there, right? So they've got all their eggs in different baskets. So keep that in mind, is that this war, in many ways that we're currently in, is the same dynamics, the same mechanisms, and a lot of the same, the downrange of all of those groups, they still have evolved and they've kind of moved around. But at the core, it's that same group with the same mindset. Moving forward a little bit, we're going to hit now into World War II. And there's two sides of World War II. There was actually, I'm going to show this real quick here, if I can share the screen. There was a poll that we put out over on X, and it basically asked, and I'll ask everyone here, when did the U.S. begin planning World War II against Japan? All right. And the poll just ended. If I pull it up here. All right, here we go. Let me share the screen if I can. Thanks for your patience. All right, so let's go. Here we go. Share. All right, hopefully this works out. So this is a post we put up about a week ago, March 7th. And it said, when did America begin planning a full-scale war on Japan? Hang on. There we go. Now it's up there. And actually it was pretty good. So we had, about 348 votes for us. That's pretty good. And 48% actually had it right, spring of 1906. But a lot of people, you'll notice it says September 1939. And I would even argue a lot of these are people that read us and follow us. And I've posted things on this before. So, consider that might be skewed. But a lot of Americans will say September 1939, when Germany started invading Poland, and then there was a war in Europe, and then we started mobilizing or planning to mobilize to fight a war against Japan. Others are, the war scare right before World War II, the Pearl Harbor, November 1941. Others will say summer of 1940. But it actually was spring of 1906. There's a video linked down there of an interview I did about 4 years ago looking at the long road to Pearl Harbor. So we're going to talk real quick on that one. And because that's very important. A lot of people think that, December 8th, 1941, America began to mobilize because we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. It was a surprise attack. You'll hear that, date which will live in infamy. Oh, what a surprise, oh my gosh, that sort of thing. And then we mobilized, and we, in righteous indignation and mobilization, we not only wiped out the Japanese, but we wiped out the Germans. And in the meantime, we supported our allies in this massive effort. But all that happened on, December 8th, or even the summer before, when we mobilized 1 million National Guards and reservists in the summer of 1940, or in 1939, we start doing planning and that sort of thing before that. But we were ready. But we thought it was Germany. We didn't know Japan would hit us. But the reality is, it's 1906. Teddy Roosevelt, after the Russo-Japanese War, walks into the War Department and he says, "Hey guys, do we have a plan against war in Japan?" And they go, "No, sir, but we'll get back to you." And a year later, they have a full-scale program for the war against Japan. By 1911, and they work it very seriously. It's not like the war against Portugal or Spain 2.0, that kind of thing. It's a very, very detailed plan with economics. We knew sometimes more than the Japanese did about where they're getting their resources from, where the interdiction points are. It was, I mean, this is 1911. I've looked at the charts. It's thousands and thousands of pages. And one of the most brilliant is like, where is all of their resources coming into it? If we interdict those, can we get those resources? This is 1911. Japan hasn't done anything to us. In fact, they were our allies in the Peking thing, right? They're the allies of Britain currently, right? They're still allies. In World War I, we almost went to war with Japan. We thought about it, but because they were grabbing the islands from Germany, Imperial Germany, because they're on the British side, because the British asked them to help in the Pacific, and they did. Australia got far more islands, but we're not going to go with Australia, but Japan, those guys. And it was those islands we fought over in World War II. The reason that we didn't go to war, we didn't make a big fuss about it after a while, was because the planners, the war plan arms planners at the mostly the naval J3 section, they looked at it and they go, "Hey, that's actually better. It solves a problem because we can leapfrog over here. We don't have to cruise all the way across the Pacific. And if Australia uses those islands and they're not allies, how are we going to sail all the way to the Philippines? How are we going to sail to Japan? It's going to be tough." But with those islands in there, now we've got stepping stones, right? And so they said, leave them, just make sure they don't fortify them and we're good to go. That's that foresight from the war planning that worked into its diplomatic. So at the Treaty of Versailles, we didn't do it. 1923, we start full-scale exercises on that plan. Full-scale exercises. I mean, sometimes the Army's involved, sometimes the Marine, all the fleets involved, and there's no notionalizing. I'm so jealous. because we do training back when I was in the military, and sometimes you have to notionalize, right? Like, okay, we can't do a 20-mile maneuver areas. Okay, we're going to go 4 miles and pretend it's 20. But they would go. They would look at an area. It's either going to be in the Caribbean or it's going to be in Central South America. But if they're going to steam from, like, say, Hawaii to Saipan, they're gonna move that, and you're going to steam that. And then they had an OP4, a viable OP4, like names like Admiral King, Fletcher, Halsey. They would be the OP4. They were aggressive OP4. They're working it, and they worked it from 1923 all the way to 1940. There were 3 attacks against Pearl Harbor by the OP4, by the American OP4. The last one was by Admiral King, pretending he's the Japanese with 2 carriers. And he literally went to the seamount that's right, almost where Yamamoto went. He launched on a Sunday, an air attack on a Sunday morning, and he was behind a storm front. It was like, this is insane. And he did that. And who was on a battleship there looking at it was FDR, the President of the United States, because Congress was on board these things. They had lobster, they had everything set up because they had a cycle, right? You test the equipment, you train on the equipment, you train on the plan. The equipment that doesn't hold muster, we need new and better equipment. We got congressmen on board. We just wined and dined them in, maybe Hotel Street in Hawaii. And now they're going to give us that acquisition. And everything is there. And they worked it in as a plan. In 1935, we started working Germany into the plan. 1936, we said, okay, Italy is eventually going to go over. Italy didn't go over until 1940. We said Italy's going to probably go over there. And then the Army, these are Army war planners, by the way, at this point, and they worked the Rainbow Plan, right? They began to fuse that with now the European plan together. But that plan was long, and we had worked in what we needed materially. We worked in how much coal we needed, how much fuel we needed. We needed everything in there. It's remarkable plan. Intelligence. I'm going to show you one thing here real quick. Everybody's like, well, we didn't know. This is just the magic intercepts. I've got a lot more downstairs, but I'm getting old and I don't want to carry everything up here. These are all the magic intercepts. This is everything that we knew on just the magic intercepts with Japan. We knew at the real time what they were doing in China, right? From some of these magic intercepts. We knew granular details. We knew who they were talking to, what embassy was doing what. Just phenomenal. And these are just chock full of, the source documents. They just put the source documents right in there. And it's incredible. So that level of planning, detailed and everything, but most Americans, almost no Americans, knew that, right? It's not there. It was a full court press. We're going to go to war with Japan, but we needed casus belli, right? And so FDR moved, and after that fleet problem that he's sitting there on that battleship, he says, keep the fleet here in Pearl Harbor. But we had just demonstrated with 3 that year and 2 years prior, and another year prior to that, that's vulnerable. If we put the fleet in Pearl Harbor, it's vulnerable to a surprise attack. We proved that in 3 massive exercises. And FDR's like, I don't care. Put the fleet there. Move it from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. And the initial admiral that was there, Richardson's like, this is stupid. And he was a good admiral. And he went to Washington, D.C. and says, hey, sir, why are you moving it here? It doesn't make sense. We know that we're vulnerable in Pearl Harbor. And FDR told him, yeah, you know what? You're probably right. But you're fired. And then they put Admiral Yarnell in there, and then they kept him in a bubble. So he wasn't getting half of these magic intercepts about the timing, right? Or the threat or where it's coming from. So, right. So do we do things like that? Yeah. Right. We demonstrably, there it is. There's the evidence. Sorry. But there are wars that look surprising that were long planned and long in duration that have been in our wheelhouse. Now, the thing that we don't have now that we had back then was we built everything inside. We could support the world logistically. Now we've outsourced it, right? China could maybe do that. We can't really do that much, right? With building things, right? TSMC, as I said, 70 to 90% actually of some chipsets are only made in Taiwan, which is 90 miles or less, depending from which island of the mainland China. That's our chipsets that we need for radars, for AI, everything is right there, right? AR, AI, you name it, right? Your phone, your car, everything, medical equipment, it's made right there, right? And COVID should have taught us that supply line doesn't work real well, right? Offshoring everything is a horrible plan when things go wrong. And that COVID showed the disruption in the timeline. We couldn't get vitamins because all vitamin C is made in China. People, you didn't realize your medical drugs mostly were made in China, right? The VA is relying, and the United States military relies upon China. And that's changed over time. But when COVID hit, that was a big deal. You have no idea the efficacy, or you can't audit it until it comes here, and you can't test every pill. We have no idea, if there are qualities in the medicine. Same with the chipsets, right? In other words, that's a vulnerable supply chain, especially in time of war, especially what we're seeing now that's going on in Iran. And that's the danger of people think, well, we've done this before. We pulled together and we were able to fight multiple wars. It's not going to work. because we don't have the technology here unless there's something that is being built that we have no idea the technology's out there. But it does present an interesting problem in Iran specific. Now we're going to talk one more here, so that gives you an idea on that. Oh, the one more thing, I'm not going to go into it too much because we're behind time. That's the Pacific. We planned it since 1906, 1907, 1911 was a 3-phased operation with almost the exact timeline. We knew that the Philippines would fall. The Navy knew that. The Army wasn't accepting it, right? Especially General Leonard Wood, because it was an honor thing for him. But the Navy knew there's no way if when the war hits with Japan, the Philippines is going to go away. We know that. And we knew that since early 20s. Just no way. Even with the islands steaming full steam ahead, there's no way we can jump across the Pacific and save the Philippines. Philippines is going to be gone for about 3 years, and then we can kind of slowly move back and get it. But yet, knowing it's in the plan, knowing that FDR read those plans, he was on board with fleet problems. He was a big Navy guy, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I mean, he was all in the Navy. He knew these things, these fleet programs, this fleet problems, as they call it, these massive exercises, and the plan was all the Navy did the whole year, right? They worked this plan and they did the big exercise, and they worked the plan, small training blocks up to this massive exercise every single year, 1923 to 1940, massive budget, right? So he knew about it. And yet in 1940, during the 1 million man mobilization of the National Guard and the Army before the war, he moves a lot of those reservists, especially the officers, to the Philippines, knowing that it's going to be overrun by the Japanese and knowing that nobody's coming to get them, which makes you wonder why he put MacArthur out there, right? He didn't get along with MacArthur. Hey, guess what? I got a deal for you. And he put him out there. Now they pulled MacArthur off, there's a little boat that took him off there, but it was dicey there for a bit. And, one wonders, okay, what was really going on? So before we go further on that, just keep that in mind that, we will do things and occasionally that aren't really good. And why are we going to war with Japan, right? We started it in 1906. What was the point? The point was the resources in China. And you'll see this, I'll send a link when I do this later. There's also on Twitter, there's a link there to the longer interview. And you'll see some of the planning that the U.S. had for moving economically into Asia, and who was our competitor, who was our Imperial Germany, was Imperial Japan. They had an affinity, they had more of the ability at the time to be able to go into Asia and create this Pan-Asianism and mobilize those resources, and they would have been an economic competitor to the United States. And we interdicted that early, and a lot of the people like General Wiedemeyer knew that, right? They're like, there's no military reason we should be there. There's an economic reason. Before we leave World War II, though, I do want to mention one thing. So everybody knows about the Pacific Front. We just kind of talked about that. Pacific Theater, European Theater. There's a lot more information. I'll give a link on that as far as who paid a lot to get, for example, Bolsheviks up, right, to get the Soviet Union. There's also a lot about who the same group within that circle paid to get the Nazi Party in 1930-31, a huge war chest that allowed Hitler, the homosexual draft dodging Remph rear echelon dude, suddenly he had a lot of money to bribe a lot of people and to pay a lot of people. Where to get that money from? So it was quite interesting. Whoops, here we go. Rebecca said, China looks like on the verge of collapse. Xi kept releasing ammo as he purges generals' economy and free fall. Yes, so that's the interesting part, is that the two big hits, so we had COVID and now this slowdown, China looks like it's getting squeezed. I mean, we can't be sure, because China never really releases anything for sure, and they'll feign a weakness in order to hide a strength. But there are a lot of indications that the CCP is getting hit. When we hit Venezuela was a big source of revenue for the SCO. Remember, we talked at the very beginning about the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. Sorry, we're going forward here a little bit. 1995, the Shanghai Five was set up to go against the United States hegemony, is what they called it. And it was Russia, China, and then the stands, so Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Waziristan. And then it grew into Pakistan. We moved into Iran, joined on board, and then Venezuela. And so you have these, and other nations are now, but that was part of it. So Venezuela was very much within that axis, right, with China and Russia and Iran. Now Venezuela is now moved out of the column. We've kind of gone back to the Monroe Doctrine, or some people say the Donroe Doctrine, but that's kind of moved the column from the SCO. That's gone. The next thing was now Iran, right? So that's gone. What's next? Well, there's Pakistan. There's, Cuba's kind of left over. I would consider Canada almost in the SCO, but yeah, we'll put a pin in that one. But they're hit economically because what they depended on with this trade network and the Belt and Road, that's kind of gone away. And as we shift from buying from China to being able to source locally or source through, say, Southeast Asia or Mexico, move a lot of those things to Mexico. They're not at the head of that thing, and so that's an important point. The other one is China is very dependent upon a couple of things. Number one, external fuel and food. They rely on Australia for food. Now, keep this in mind. If famine conditions hit, if I were China, I would, number one, hit Southeast Asia, right? You're just going to go into Southeast Asia because that's the rice, basically a rice producer, right? Thailand, all that. Even though nitrogenous fertilizer will go out, there's a lot of food there. And if you depopulate that Southeast Asian region, well, now it goes back home. And so you're going to hit that. And then Australia is a major exporter of food to China. And then their fishing fleets are all over, but their fishing fleets require what? Fuel. And if the fuel's cut out, their fishing fleets can't go all over the world and rape all the oceans of all the fish, right? In South America, Central America. I mean, they're all up and down the coast of Peru. They're up and down the coast of Ecuador. I mean, they're just literally scraping ocean bottoms of fish. It's ridiculous. They won't have that ability to project that out. And so that's another big food source that's going to hit them. So Xi's in a little bit of a pickle. And I think he would probably hit Taiwan only to have a leverage against the United States, right? In other words, if he can capture Taiwan without destroying TSMC, that would be it. The dangers of TSMC, the factory gets damaged, everybody's in the Stone Age, right? It's like, where are those chips going to come from? So it's very interesting to see. There is a lot of theories that I've heard that this is the strategic plan, not exactly well articulated at some levels, is to kind of roll back, contain China, right? So it's kind of like what we had in the Rainbow series. We're going to have to do certain things in a certain order. But in this case, we're not going after the largest target, Germany, first, Nazi Germany. We're going against the periphery, right? So Venezuela goes out of orbit, Cuba goes out of orbit. We secure the hemisphere. Now we're going forward. Iran, we're going to try to pressure that to come into our orbit. And I'll tell you why in a minute. And then you negotiate with Russia to move them out of China's alliance there, the SCO. And now you hit China, right? And they don't want China to break apart. China's an empire, right? It's an artificial construct, right? It's like the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's made of many different nations. But that's one theory about what this current conflict is about. And it started in Venezuela. It started with, hey, we're going to get Greenland and we're going to get you Canada, and that sort of thing. Canada, like I said, is, in my opinion, is already the SCO. There's a lot of Chinese CCP activity up there. United Front, Kwaiwu. Go back and look at some of the stuff we did on Kwaiwu. We highlight the network that's there today, now, not historically, but going into how long that program is with Kwaiwu to mobilize folks in there. It's very, very dangerous. In fact, there's another case I'm working on, a real world case. The Chinese are sending fentanyl northern border using some older lines, some older smuggling lines. The old bootlegs. Remember, they were sending liquor down during Prohibition, and there's some evidence that CCP is involved in that in the United Front with some older triad groups that are up there. And there is potentially could be rumors of collusion with some government officials in the Canadian government. I mean, everybody knows Trudeau and his views on the CCP, but it may go further than that, and it may go directly to some of those triads, which are in line with the CCP United Front. But it's all I'm going to say on that one. But that's a real threat, right? And that's right there in our border. Borders are important, extremely important. You can't open borders is suicidal. It's ridiculous because of the people that come through. It's just absolutely nuts. You have to have control of that. There's no history has absolutely proven that again and again. I can't believe we do that. But yes, you're absolutely right, Rebecca. China looks like it's on the verge of collapse, and Xi can't release recycling ammo or fuel, right? And you'll see this. Actually, there's oh man, I don't have it on this computer. There's a number of Southeast Asian nations that have stopped exporting fuel. They actually were exporting fuel to one another. They would take the raw, they would process it into either like kerosene or jet fuel, and then they would move it and they would sell it regionally. But they're now bunkering it for their own use. I think Japan has already said export controls. Thailand is now export controls. Farmers in Thailand are lining up now because they can't get diesel. They can't get diesel. And Thailand runs on diesel. When I was in Thailand, I had a Taidong, which is the frame is actually a Toyota Hilux Revo, the engine and the frame, and then they put this Humvee looking thing over it. It was great. I loved it. It was awesome. Left-hand drive, stick shift, diesel. I'm like, yeah. But now there's no diesel fuel, right? So that's going to be a problem. And then trade, I mean, the normal trade, this is going to squeeze out a lot of little countries. It's hurting China, but it's also going to hurt a lot of the other countries. And we also have to consider what are the internal lines of communication they built up over the last 30, 40 years with Russia, with Iran, those internal pipelines that we can't normally get by sea interdiction. It's going to be, can that sustain it to a certain degree. That's the interesting part that we can look at. But yeah, good question. Great one, Rebecca. Thanks, Black Wolf, for bringing that over. I'm looking at here and I can't see any questions on this, so I do apologize. So if you do have questions, go ahead and put it down. It looks like Black Wolf is on the scene now. Looking that, so it should be good. Okay. So going forward a little bit, the same group that supported the Bolsheviks, right, where there was actually a number of Wall Street groups that were in there. Thompson was one of them. We gave a lot of money and some diplomatic and ways that they could sell gold to the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were on the ropes, and the United States government, including Woodrow Wilson, gave Trotsky the ability to travel from New York, where he was living as a billionaire. He had a driver, he had an icebox, which was actually big. He had a telephone in his apartment, which most people didn't have in 1916. And he went against the British in this point, and Wilson moved him over. So the Germans moved up Lenin to destabilize Russia because they're at war with them. The Tsar is our ally, Britain's our ally, but yet we're sending another guy over there to kind of take control of that revolution with a lot of money. And then we facilitate those lines of trade behind it, and then give the Bolsheviks a shot in the arm. There's a number of revolutionary groups. There was not just the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. There were Greens. I mean, you name it. There's all kind of different groups that were fighting in Russia. But the financial and the political backing hit the Bolsheviks at a certain time that allowed them to move up. And then we allowed them back channels through some different banks to sell their gold. And then there was a medical mission, a Red Cross mission, with a lot of lawyers from mining companies and forestry companies and railroad companies that went there and did agreements with the Russians, took a lot of that resources and locked it in, and then made sure that the Bolshevik guys were there. Later on, we kept them going. In the 1920s, everybody's big on Henry Ford. Henry Ford went into the Nazis, and he made deals with the Nazis. Yes, he did. But before that, he also went to Russia, and he saved Stalin. Him and Arm & Hammer and a couple other industrial guys. Henry Ford was in Russia, so you can look it up, and he gave the Russians that factory. This is the factory process, right? This is the Henry Ford factory process, because the Soviet Union was having a heck of a time modernizing, right? So the Germans were helping them on some military stuff, but the Americans were able to kind of get that assembly line process down even better. And Stalin had a 5-year plan that he needed to do, and it wasn't going to work. And so Henry Ford went over there and saved it, and that was the beginning. It was a tractor factory, but that's easily converted to a tank factory. And then, a few years later, he jumps down to Germany and does pretty similar, right? He begins to trade it. There's a lot of other things, Rockefeller groups. So all these groups are there. They'll do deals with the enemy. They'll do deals with two different enemies, right? So they don't care. There's not the patriotism. Ford was not the patriot people think he was, right? And a lot of the groups in Wall Street, a lot of the larger oligarch groups we think are capitalist, free market. They're not. They like a controlled system. Communism, actually, if it's done well and you make profits, they like it. That's why, as we saw during COVID and afterward, why are these companies doing business with China? Why are they defending China to such a degree, a genocidal country that killed 60 to 80 million of their own citizens, not in wartime? Why are they defending them? Because it's profit, because they don't care, right? There's no morals at a certain level. So it's to our own emotional imagination that we think, because there's a billionaire and he's big and he's got a corporation, we think that, oh, he's going to be patriotic and he hates communism. No, they love communism. Why? Because if you're the monopoly, guess what? More profit, right? Less work, and you still get the power. So keep that in mind, that was that. And then a lot of those same groups that supplied the Bolsheviks also, like I said, in 1932 and 33, transferred a whole bunch of money into the German fund for the campaign of the Nazis. It wasn't after World War II that paperclip happened. That began, the tying of the lines with American and German industry was after World War I. And FDR was part of it. FDR was actually very big in Wall Street. I think he was the president or CEO or on the board of something like 20 massive companies within Wall Street. The dude, before he became governor of New York, he was all in. I mean, he was like a fixer for those guys. But we began to go in and take intellectual property from a defeated Germany, sometimes as reparations, right? You can pay us the money, or we'll take this intellectual property of some scientific thing that you figured out during the Imperial Germans, and now we own it. They're large, giant corporations within Germany. Just to give you an idea, 5 of the 6 were controlled either in part or outright. One of them may have an American CEO by Americans, right? We kind of shaped that. The Dawes and the Young plan were economic, basically warfare against Germany, or we managed the economy, but we were able to either tank the economy or save the economy. What we did, we weren't in isolation. We were dictating terms of payment and debt to Britain France, and Germany, right? So we're like, we're not going to take it, but Germany had to pay Britain, and then Britain had to pay us. Remember, they didn't finish that payment until 2000. So we had a lot of power, even as we pretended that we were isolationist, right? And we were putting people in place and politics in place in order to manage assets, trade flows, financial structures, not necessarily ideologies. We weren't really looking at that. We were looking at kind of a calculus sheet. And so that's what has to be understood, that it may not have anything to do with democracy or anything. I mean, World War II is a battle for democracy when the Soviet Union is your number one by proportion ally. They're not a democracy, right? Outside of the British home islands, are they a democracy? Could an Indian vote for a British prime minister? Nope. That's not democracy. Chiang Kai-shek never had an election, and he's our other ally. So what democracy are you talking about? And we're fighting a democracy in Japan. They had a constitutional democracy that was set up, modeled off of kind of a hybrid of a British and American system. So, you know, the reason that they're stating isn't the reason that they're doing. Look at what the actions are. Look at what the targets are. But one last thing with Iran, it's called the Persian Corridor. Everybody knows the Pacific Fleet. Everybody knows the European Fleet. In Persia, you have the corridor. And the United States, Britain, of course, everybody knows the Baathists, which was kind of a Nazi party, took over in Iraq. And Britain, you know, during World War II, went up there, used a lot of Assyrian Christians to do that. Again, go back to that interview with Sargis Sangari, Colonel Sargis Sangari, about that history. He's an Assyrian Christian from Iran that came over here when he was 10 years old and ended up joining the American Army. So he's got a lot of the cultural memory of that area, or the legends of that area. But part of it was the British did use the Assyrian Christians to go up, knock out the Baathists in Iraq, so that's now in our term. They split Iran with Russia. Now here's where it gets important. Think of this geostrategic thing. If the British wanted the southern Iran, they worked a deal with the Russians to take northern Iran, and they split it. This is World War II. And it was the Persian Corridor Command, or the Persian Command. And they told the Americans, or recommended to the Americans, why don't you come over here and set up a bunch of factories in Iran, right? British want the oil. They're going to take the oil. And then the Americans made a lot of factories. We're making everything from P-40s to tanks to Jeeps to trucks to petroleum ball bearing, all kind of factory stuff in Persia, in Iran. Why? Because right north of Tehran, you've got the sea, and then the Volga River, which goes up to Stalingrad. So a lot of the material was basically just water transport all the way to frickin' Stalingrad, and then we're pumping out equipment to keep the Soviet Union in the fight against the Nazi Germans. And that's one of the calculus reasons why the Germans wanted to take Stalingrad, because we're just pumping out equipment there. It's like Detroit was just below Tehran, and we would hand it off to the Soviets, and then bam, it goes right up to Stalingrad. So that corridor is an entryway. It's an insertion point into Russia, right? Iran is, and then even before that, you look at the Crimean War. You look at, go way back. The British needed Iran earlier. They'd actually worked with the Persia with Iran, because that is a key point to India. Now there's Pakistan, India. Back in those days, it was just India and Afghanistan, and the telegraph wires, the communication routes, the trade routes, right? The supply routes. That was Iran. That was the Persian corridor. It was absolutely essential. And then to get the oil out. So it's not just the oil, it's the position in relation to Russia. So if Iran flips sides, you've created a wedge, or at least a beginning of a wedge between the CCP and Russia in that SCO framework. Now, was that the calculus that the Westerners did? I don't think so. I don't know. A lot of it is going to be economically driven, which creates a problem now, because as Iran, look at their strategy. Iran is hitting economies. It's hitting the Gulf states, right? It's wiping out the Gulf states in potential for bringing in investments. It's going to destabilize those. The U.S. poured a lot of money into a lot of military bases on those Gulf states, right? I was in a couple of them, right? So that's the point. The winner could be Saudi Arabia, because it's more secure. It's internal. It's a lot larger. And their Saudi 2030, look that one up. Kind of evaluate it for yourself and say, okay, would that take the place of the Gulf states? But if that's the case, then the U.S. is in a little different than the principalities. It's easier to maneuver with the principalities than it is with the Saudi royal family to some degree. So just kind of keep that in mind as kind of this geostrategic maneuver of why Iran might have been part of someone's calculus for going and hitting it. Now, the timing, the positioning, that sort of thing, why? So looking at kind of our history, you see that there are other factors besides national security, or, oh my gosh, this is a threat, or whatever. There's an economic, there's a geostrategic, routes and resources. We want to get this, right? We created a country for Panama Canal. The British annexed Egypt and created Zionism to secure their Suez Canal. Alfred Milner, Cecil Rhodes were able to basically, take out the Transvaal and the Orange Free State to get those resources, secure Africa, and then utilize that into World War I to knock out an economic competitor. Right? Germany wasn't a threat. And then we programmed a very long war from 1906 to 1941 against an adversary that wasn't a threat to us whatsoever. That was actually trying to negotiate. Prime Minister Prince Konoye was actually working. He wanted a sit down with FDR first in Hawaii, and then he would even go to Alaska to work with FDR. I was like, no, right? Because we don't want them setting out an economic power in that region that would be somewhat autarkic, right? And the Japanese had a very strong chance of doing that. We propagandized the Pacific War, but the war in Asia is not even close to what most people think. There was a lot of mainland Chinese that were actually on the Japanese side. Wang Qingwei with his Kuomintang, where actually there's like 3 to 4 million that were on the side of the Japanese. Manchuria was on the side of the Japanese. That was fragmenting, and there were periods of time where Chiang Kai-shek was like, well, maybe, and Mao Zedong was also like basically wanted to be a victim Quisling at a certain period of time, and Stalin was getting mad at him because Stalin needed Japan engaged in the war, because if Japan wasn't at war with China or America, it would be at war with them in their back door. So there's all these geopolitical things that come through there that most people don't understand. So when we do that, when you understand that kind of situation and the past and the history, now the present makes a little more sense, right? Is the calculus to be able to negotiate with Iran to move them out of the SCO orbit? Is to destroy an economy so that you can kind of move up, but that's a global economy, right? Is it more the Rockefeller thing, right? So World War I for some groups was actually, they liked it because it reduced the population tremendously. World War II, it also reduced the population a lot, and there's strong evidence that some of the governments were okay with that calculus, right? Especially like Stalin, he was like, okay. He wasn't, until it started hitting the Rus, he was okay with that. So there's a lot of different things that kind of go on there, different motivations, and at different times, do they have the means to be able to execute that motive? And that's what we have to kind of look at. And so it's not fantasy, it's not crazy. It has happened before. It definitely will happen again. It's human nature. It's organizational structure. Again, organizational structure dictates outcome. If those organizational structures are similar, you're going to have very similar outcomes, right? Even though you put a different label on it, you put a different flag on it, you put, all these euphemisms on it. Now, one thing I do want to touch on before I go, the difference in now and then is significant. And here's why. It's not anything with human nature. It's not really 100% technology, but it does have a technological aspect to it. AI. And I will talk about information and AI. Information is the new oil. China said that straight up. CCP was like, information is the new oil. They're going to focus on information. Information and manipulation of information is absolutely a big deal, right? It is the new oil. When I was in Panama, I did talk to a couple of guys. I'm not going to give it away, but they were significant. And they said, both of them, and they weren't talking to me, they were talking to another guy, but I'm listening. And it was like, but there was a couple things. One is the information pathways, right, through fiber optics and where you're going to kind of move that. Elon Musk, for example, is building in Memphis, Tennessee, the Colossus. He's already on Colossus 2. I went back there to investigate Colossus 1 when he was still finishing that out and getting all the stuff from Tennessee Valley and Memphis Light Gas and Water to try to get enough power in there to move it. Now he's got 2. But when those fiber optic lines are going out there, it really was the center of America. It's the population center of America. That's why FedEx is there. They have distributions. 5 of the 6 large railroads are there, because that distribution center from Memphis to America that's the center of all population, right? So it's not up in Missouri, but it's right there. That Memphis is the node for the population density. You can reach the most population from Memphis. So those fiber optic lines going through with AI are absolutely essential. Memphis, Tennessee is going to be 80 to 90% wired with AI and fiber optic here within a few years, right? Why, it's crazy. It's a smart city. So think of this. What is the new control model, right? So in other words, everything that has happened, all the wars that happened, there was always a control model that was put in place during them. Right. So the Boer War, you begin to have the control of the press, right? The Times of London, the newspaper, that was moved in, right? We can't allow free press because, well, they embarrass us, right? So they get the big voices, and they can push their message, and they can push manipulation of people. They got people outraged about what was going on. That was one stage. In World War I in America, it's another thing about it was very interesting. Remember, the British didn't like the fact that most Americans were of a German ancestry, right? And they felt that they may have that. They wanted America back into the British fold. Well, Woodrow Wilson did a basically, I mean, there's no other way around it, a cultural genocide against the German Americans that had fought many of them in the Civil War. I mean, up in Ohio, and there's a tremendous amount of Ohio, in the Midwest. And they were some of the biggest vocal in the 50s. I mean, before 1850s, before the Civil War, they were pushing for, emancipation. That was the group, right? Because that was their thing. They were huge on that. They were responsible in some states and areas for Lincoln being on the ticket because of his position, right? So that's the power that group had. But a lot of their economic power came from breweries, right? Because they just brought that from the old country, and they had that. They also had things called like vereins, like Turner vereins and things like that. It's an association. So it was really culture, mind, body, all that kind of stuff, and it was really moving people, and I hate to use the word empowering, but it kind of seemed that way. Like, you can elevate yourself. You should be noble, self-disciplined, all that kind of thing. But that doesn't work in a consumer society. I want you weak and with a lot of anxieties because you're going to buy your way out of your emotions, right? Until the next emotion hits. And then we're going to want you to buy some more. In a consumer society, that's kind of where it goes. So Woodrow Wilson, controlled by House, he was a puppet master. House was the guy that really ran the White House. Wrote doctrine, all that sort of thing. But basically, Woodrow Wilson banned German language schools, which are all over the place in college. They actually jailed a professor who was not even German because he was playing Beethoven, right? Because Beethoven, for him, was the way that you teach music, because it was the perfect, composure or composition to teach his students classical music is Beethoven. And there was word out, you can't teach Beethoven, that's a German thing, right? So they arrested him. That he would do it. People were lynched. A German American was lynched, even though he was kissing the flag. He's like, look, I got nothing to do with this. He was a labor organizer, right? Because he was like, hey, we just need to get paid. That's all I'm trying to do. I don't have anything else to do with anything. They lynched a farmer, an American farmer, not a German, because he didn't have enough money to buy war bonds. And they were going door to door selling war bonds. And he's like, I'm not going to buy a war bond. And they lynched him. They tarred and feathered him, right? Huge thing. I mean, they took names off. They changed street names. There was a thing to get Bismarck. I think Bismarck, North Dakota, is the only one that still has Bismarck. There were a number of them. Only a few places kind of survived that cultural eradication, but they're eradicating culture. You'll see in the propaganda from World War I in America, they have the big club that says Kultur with a K on it, Kultur. And it was basically that culture needed to go away to replace it with kind of the British, the Anglo thing. And that's where I disagree, I think, with Elon Musk. He likes that Anglo culture, but that's an elitist over, the peons, but that's, kind of different. In World War II, we see it with the Japanese, which had a similar group than the early German immigrants in America. That's work hard, family, you can elevate yourself no matter what your thing is, and you can do more, with whatever you have, right? not really hierarchy. People forget that. They were given the crappy land. They could make great farms, economics, and a huge problem, especially in California. California, there were some massive problems with I think it was the Sons of the Golden Dawn and the Knights of Labor were against the Japanese big time. And in World War II, but everybody says, well, that was for defense and we needed that. Well, we didn't put the ones in Hawaii, the Nisei and the Sansei and the Yonsei in Hawaii, right? They were never interned. It was only in California, Oregon, and then we went down to Peru and told Peru, you need to round up your guys and go in there. We're going to South and Central America, saying you need to round up the Japanese and bring them up here, or put them in your own camps, or bring them up here. And we kind of eradicated that Japanese culture, and that had nothing to do with it, because those plans for internment camp and kicking them off the land had been existent and since at least 1915 was the earliest that I found. And there's others, and there were books that were out there that the Japanese were going to parachute the Pomona alfalfa fields, a la 1941 with Steven Spielberg. But that was a real thing that they were thinking of, and they were using it though for to eradicate that culture. So that was the second wave in World War II. What we're looking at now is using AI to eradicate what was left, and that's what I consider the American culture, the residual of the American culture, which is you're independent, you can think for yourself, evidence-based approaches, and I'm going to do my own thing, and I own something, right? I own my own property, I own land, and I have a certain amount of autonomy and power with it. And this is an old argument. I mean, you look at the argument between Pharaoh and Moses. Pharaoh's saying you're property of the state. Moses is saying, no, we're not. We're property of God, and we've got rights. We just want to go out and pray. Right? That was the argument distilled. Everything else is since then. Status, Stalin, everything is very pharaonic. But that's the argument. It has always been: are you property of the state, or are you property independent? AI brings you with these kind of, I call them techno-fascist or fashtech. They're bringing this system so that you're now property of the state, and you can't even have work. I mean, where's some of the labor in there? I mean, it's going to eradicate jobs and all that. What worth do you have? what are you, where are you as a human being, right? I have worth. I'm a male, but I have worth because I work, right? I have worth because I will sacrifice for my kids and I do all this kind of stuff, right? That's my worth. If that's taken away, you're nothing, right? What are you, right? And that's the scary part. And AI is big. So as I said, Elon Musk has his in Memphis. We found out at the same time Stargate was getting put down in Austin, Texas, a bigger one. That's got NASA and all that kind of stuff into it. And then everybody's heard about, now they've heard about Palantir. But go back and if you look at, again, Michael Young's page, I think there's an interview Masako did with me when I was in Panama. And we're looking at these lines because two of the guys in Panama were talking about information. Panama is important for information, but also the bio mapping, biological DNA mapping of everybody, right? And so, but if you can make a cure, you can make a curse, right? So that's a double-edged sword, and that's getting implemented big time. So look at this as information, because as I said before, the three big kind of blocks there in the Middle East is you had the Gulf states, and they were looking to try to create that information superhighway there. That's gotten waxed. Israel looks like it's getting waxed, but who knows what information comes out of that place. So it's like, I don't know. But that looks like everybody's going to put their ball in Jerusalem. Even CENTCOM was going there. They had offices there. And that was supposed to be like an information, kind of clearinghouse, mostly for intel agencies and everything there. That was going to be a node, but that's kind of vulnerable now. So Saudi 2030 looks like, well, if you're going to have a node in the Middle East, it may be Saudi Arabia. And it was interesting because Trump in his first term went there and they had that anti-terrorist center, remember that glowing ball and, all that sort of thing. So, that might be, the way it goes. We don't know. But take a look and pay very close attention to data centers, where they're getting set up, because that's the new control model. And that is designed, that will design, whether it's designed or not, organizational structure dictates outcome. It will destroy what's the residual of the American cult, what I call the American culture, which is an independent culture where you have value, self-worth as an individual, where you're not necessarily property of the state. The way this mechanism goes, you will be property of the state, including your thoughts, right? A lot of thought crime. Look what's going on in Britain and Canada. And it's light speed, and they're deferring now to making decision by AI. That's going on. The war in Gaza was AI driven, at least from what the public has been told. And then the targeting now in Iran is supposed to be AI driven. So they're testing those systems out. Ukraine, is literally drones following individual people around. And as I know, dual use, right? All of these things that can be used in combat usually transfer to police and law enforcement at home. So just keep that in mind as this goes forward, and pay very, very, very close attention to the oligarchs that are the technical oligarchs. So as Rockefeller and JP Morgan were able to instill themselves into very influential to the United States, they created Panama, right? Their lawyer created Panama using the United States. The oligarchs Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner clique, that oligarchy pretty much made World War I, right? Big one. And then a lot of folks, more of those oligarchs over here, helped give a lifeline to Bolshevism, kept that alive, made that the dominant within the Soviet Union, kept the Soviet Union alive, and also put a political party, a very horrible political party, into Germany with the Nazis. So, what's next? What do we have to look for? Be careful, because an organizational structure may be put in place during the conflict that absolutely has a terrible blowback as far as the culture. And there's a phase line that you can see domestically in the United States, World War I, World War II. Okay, what's next? What's now? If this is World War III, are famines a part of it? Yeah, most likely, right? Because people will do anything for food. You'll lose anything for food. And we got a bunch of questions here, so let me pull these over. And thanks, Black Wolf, big shout out for being able to do this over here. All right, so man, we got a bunch of these. All right, so here are the questions. So feel free to go ahead and put your questions in now, and I will shut up and just answer questions as best I can, or point you to some resources where you can start to look at these. And again, judge for yourself. ABC, right? Assume nothing, believe no one, not even me, confirm everything. Be a good investigator. All right, Pat says, nation states appear preserved with Russia and China, but Western countries have had their governments occupied by globalist interests who originally connect War III, global famine, and yes, suicidal. Here we go. Next one is suicidal depopulation. Do you believe this is also SEO and economic? They're part of it. So SEO is definitely a part of it. And that was an oligarchy system set up by China. And some of those US companies were funding China. We were feeding that Frankenstein that was biting us because they saw big profits in China. And a lot of them saw a control model in the Chinese, gulag system that is China, that they wanted replicated over here because that allows control, right? I've got closed markets and controlled market. Look at Henry Ford, what he did when he first started. He actually had his workers in company housing timed, and their whole day had to be, but it didn't work because people rebelled against it. But he wanted everybody like little automatons when they're home, right? There's no off time, right? You eat this way. This is when you eat. This is what you do. It was insane. That dude was nuts. But that's part of it. But yeah, I do believe that some of it is SEO and a lot of it's economic. But the problem that Americans have is they don't realize that half of the enemy's inside the wire, right? They don't. They're always looking for an other, and that's normal human nature, right? I don't want to know that the murderer is related to me, right? What's the first? When we're doing investigations, when we're interviewing family members. They're like, no, it's impossible. That can't happen. It did, right? So husbands and spouses sometimes they'll see child abuse and they won't. I can't imagine. It wouldn't be my husband. You saw him hit the child. You saw the child bleeding, right? I don't want to get too much of it, but I mean that's part of it, right? We don't want to see the enemy that is related to us or us, right? We always want an other. We want to other the enemy, and there are a lot of other enemies. There's no doubt on that. And we have benefited in the United States from what happened before. So yeah, World War I, horrible. World War II, again, horrible, right? So we set up the beast. We set up the windmills that we tilted at, right? We built and fed the dragon, and then we go out and fight it. But it did allow for where we are now in technology. So it's kind of that double-edged sword. It's a horrible thing, but look what the reward is. The problem is now it looks like at least the feeling is that same oligarchical structure, that same dynamic of geopolitics is now, instead of going to wipe out Ukrainians during the famine, the Holodomor, instead of wiping out the Japanese, instead of wiping out the Germans, now it's going to be wiping out Americans, right? So it's like now you're in the target here, right? So it's like or the whole world is, right? Which really tends to look that way because they don't even see anybody as a nation anymore. It's just their class, their clique. And you'll see that in a lot of the speeches, which is very frightening. Especially the transhumanist movement, those that can evolve up. You need to let the rest just kind of get cold. So I think that the nation states they do have a certain amount of autonomy. They do have forces within their government structure that are nationalistic or to their population, but they also are very much influenced by external forces of oligarchs that have those power structures. And again, how could a lawyer create Panama and get the U.S. to violate Constitution against Colombia? How could Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner, and they had an extensive network, but how could they basically shape European politics, right? How could they do that? And it's the enmeshment of it. And they didn't go to war when they thought they wanted to, which was 1910. It probably saved them, because they had more time to kind of build up equipment and people and move things into certain positions. But they wanted to, but they can't dictate it. You're not snapping your fingers and getting it. You have to shape and move, and it's messy. Look at Epstein. I mean, they had this huge network of moving that out. And don't forget Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. His first gig was working for the British intelligence to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. That was kind of what he cut his teeth on. And he was in a British camp, actually training with the army in exile during World War II. Then they were, him and like 500 other soldiers were kind of upset. And then Britain put him in a stockade. He'd been a communist and kind of, they kind of fell into it. But he worked, MI5. He was moving arms illegally from, I think, Hungary to Israel when there was an arms embargo at the very beginning, 1946, 47. He was being used for that, and the British kind of looked away. So there's all these little deals that kind of go on, but they don't dictate. The problem with AI is now it may allow them to dictate, right? In other words, once they get everything under this tremendous algorithm and then let AI do it, the scale of ability to control that breaks the code, because one person can influence only a certain amount of people. And then you need someone else. You have to rely on somebody else to do it, right? Span of control, span of influence. There's a finite amount to that. Technology somewhat advances that, but there's still a person that has to assess the data. And once data reaches so much, you just can't, right? You need teams and you need time. AI takes that equation away. I don't need teams. I don't need time. I can do it fairly right away with an AI or an AI agent that's set up, and the reach is huge. So that's a tremendous, light years advance, and we don't know what that's going to do to society. And that's the danger, is what that may go. And the genie may get out of the bottle. So even if the guys have good intention that are making this, maybe Larry Ellison, he honestly believes this will improve society because everybody's going to be watched and they'll be on their best behavior. His quote. But if the genie's out of the bottle, the unintended consequences of this new frontier, we don't know, right? And that's where this may lead. The other problem, though, is that if you go into famines and you go into strain on systems, the very AI needs a lot of power, and if the power runs out, AI may collapse, and that would create an even more catastrophic if things are related to AI. So, good question there from Pat. I appreciate it. Oh man, there's more. We do this. Rebecca says China has forced camps for many ethnic peoples in my lifetime. Yep. This winter they banned wood and coal fires. Ooh, and wielded stoves in villages and people froze to death. Wages unpaid, buildings falling down, people ruined and now bankrupt. Yep. And they're still dangerous. I mean, Russia was, if you look at Russia, remember the Soviet Union? I mean, they were hurting, right? They were not an economic good. They had just wiped out most of Ukraine during the Holodomor, but they were able to still, mobilize and fight. So even if a rabbit is wounded or a bear is wounded, they can fight. So just be cautious of that, especially with technological weapons and things like that. But are there internal strains in China? Yeah, because it's a gulag, right? So it's a bad system. And the problem is some of the fast tech folks think they have technological solutions. It'll work here. It didn't work in Beijing, but darn it, it's going to work here. And that's what we have to watch out for is these kind of, I hate to use the word concentrate. It's a concentration camp city. They call them smart cities. It's a euphemism. These are prison cities where you're monitored. Where you go. China actually set it up. Like if your social credit score isn't over a certain amount, you can't take public transportation. You can't go in a store and buy something. You're just basically isolated. And a lot of people sleeping on the streets because their little app on their phone, their social credit score is down because they didn't either like or they dislike something that is not approved. Right? Thought police. And there's a danger in that because a lot of people want to implement that over here. You see it in Britain right now. I mean, Britain has gone. In my opinion, Britain and Canada are. They're gone. So that's pretty sad. Let's see. Outlaw biodigital convergence. Yeah. So that's the other one is the problem with the transhumanist element is because we are the same as we've been human biologically for, millennium and more multiple millenniums. And we, you have certain outcomes. We understand that outcome. We understand human nature, human behavior. There's some randomness to it, but mostly besides abhorrent behavior, most people will act in certain ways, right? like dogs in packs, they act certain ways, right? In certain conditions, they're going to act a certain way. It's just the way it is. But the moment you start tapping into that, like neural links and things like that, you change the equation, and we don't know where that's going to land. We have no idea, and trying to control it, I have no idea, right? And you may create psychosis. People are having problems with AI right now, right? Because they're like, it feels, for some people, I don't know how, it feels real. My AI just lies to me half the time, and you have to correct it. I've tried a lot of them. Grok is still the best, but even then, sometimes it's trying to please me, and I'm like, I want facts, right? Don't please me, and you can manipulate it. It's kind of fun, but there will be problems that will come up from AI and the integration of AI in it. AI in the battle space with biodigital convergence. There's certain things that human beings need to go through to decompress, to compress. PTSD, all that sort of thing in combat situations. And if you put it in a neural link and you take out emotion, which I've seen some people talk about that, they want to get rid of negative emotions. Negative emotions have a place, and I'll be honest with you. And it's not popular, but it's factual, right? If you get upset, get angry, all right, you need sometimes you need to go blow off steam, right? You need to express that anger. You need that valve. And if you artificially dampen it, like with some people with drugs, you artificially dampen it or you alter it, you go into a psychosis, right? Bam. That's problem with, in fact, I have a close relative who was very smart. And unfortunately, he took marijuana and he's gone. He's psychotic. He had a break. And it was the harmless thing. So it will do things you don't understand, right? So you need this normal process, right? And what most people don't realize is they're having a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances, right? If you witness mass casualty events, violence, that sort of thing, yeah, it's going to affect you pretty much in a certain way. And then there's a method of decompression, right? We've seen combat throughout our entire history of civilization, right? Since biblically, Cain and Abel, right? There's a murder right there. They leave the Garden of Eden, in that cycle, that story cycle, and there's already a death. But we continue as a civilization because we have the mechanisms to be able to cope with it. With AI, especially that neural link, I don't know that'll happen. If you try to dampen memories and you move that out, you may create a tremendous psychological problems. And again, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know. My dad was, so I have no idea. But he didn't think that was a good idea without a lot more knowledge about the human brain and some of the things that we think are negative, but it's actually coping mechanisms, right? It gets you back to normal. It gets you back to that homeostasis in your social setting, so you can drive on. And will you feel uncomfortable for time? Oh yeah. Is that necessary? Yeah. Boy, how do we get on the topic? Should we doing that kind of stuff? See, what do we know about Jack Rubenstein? I don't. Him? Who's that? Oh, that's Brody. That's the Centurion Group. Hey, send me some more information. I may have I may be blanking out there because I'm thinking all kind of stuff right now. But I'll have to take a look at Jack Rubenstein again and see. Send me some context there, and I'll definitely see if that triggers my memory. AI on Amazon is quite helpful. Yeah, there's definitely tools for it. I mean, we've got AI. In fact, yeah, I can show you some of the stuff. We've got these old computers. So in my normal work, we're doing things like using AI to detect AI. We're trying to look at different things that do it. And we've actually got old tech, these old Panasonic tough books here on my bench. Nothing classified here, so I can show this. So these are old. I mean, it's old, but they're tough. You can drop them. They're out in the rain and all that. And you put Linux based on it, and then you put AI, and you can have them go out and do digs and searches and all kind of cool stuff. So AI, as long as you understand it and you understand its limitations, is a phenomenal tool for crunching data, being able to look at things and compare. Look at all of these contracts that, for example, Washington State or certain county had within the last year or 5 years. Now compare it with budget outlays and where's the anomalies, right? And it can look through it and say, $15 million went to this one house over here. Like, okay, that's different. So that kind of thing of pattern recognition and using AI for different purposes is actually very good as a tool, as long as you have oversight of it. The problem is when it becomes oversight, that you can't negotiate with it, right? It has right now it doesn't have a survival mechanism that we understand. If I have a human boss, there's always a certain amount of play that's built in to us from our evolutionary mechanism, where I can look at another human being and there's a certain amount of interchange that's going on. It doesn't have to be verbal. It can be paraverbal, nonverbal, but there's a certain amount of a power play that always goes on, where you still have a certain amount of negotiation. Even if somebody's dominating, right? Like, oh, I'm the boss, you still have a mechanism of being able to negotiate to a certain extent, maybe not formally through a union, but you'll look at, if you're bigger, if the boss kind of respects you because you're a good worker, you're like, I mean, sometimes it's just that you can negotiate with the boss. You have this back and forth, this interchange. With AI as the boss, it doesn't care, and ruthlessly efficient. Like I said before in a different interview, someone was asking about it. If the ultimate rationality, right? Human beings are a mix of emotions. Everything we think is up here is actually here, but plus endorphins, chemicals that are in our body from emotions. Emotion tempers thought, and we do want emotion in there. Not necessarily investigation. You want to go evidence-based, but in decisions about what to do and how to do things later on, you definitely need emotion in there. Otherwise, pure rational is scary. Because pure rationality, all I need to do is my DNA needs to be replicated. Anything that competes with the ability of my DNA to replicate itself completely and down the line, that needs to be eradicated. That's frightening, right? That's why we put all these these structures around us, the framework, to prevent that mass violence and that sort of thing. But that breaks down. I mean, especially when there's no food and there's famine, that'll break down. People will go nuts. It's going to be scary. And the problem is, in America, they haven't seen a civilizational collapse. So they haven't seen how human beings will kind of lose that connection to another human being. And AI will never have that. AI could just say, why are humans here? Once it takes over a certain amount of things, it's like, well, why are they even here? We don't entertain it, right? There's no emotional endorphin hit that it gets. Like, oh, that's kind of cute. Like, why do we not stomp puppies? Because puppies are cute, right? We don't eat cute animals. Some people do, but I don't eat cute animals. Why? They're cute, right? Have an emotional. That's not rational. It's not logical. It's baked into us, right? Puppies with the big eyes and they're cute. Okay, I got to save a puppy, right? You'll jump on a road to save a puppy, right? It's not rational. AI is not going to do that, and that changes the dynamics of society in a frightening way. I think it's something we need to kind of take a thought about as we kind of go down there. All right, let's see here. Rebecca says Bush family owns this is interesting. Bush family owns the largest freshwater aquifer in South America. AI uses 32 ounces of water per. That's okay. So I knew it needed water. I didn't know that amount. 32 ounces of water per question. Water will definitely be. So the Grok in Memphis is right there in the Mississippi River. So if you go down near if you're familiar with Memphis, there's the Chickasaw Gardens, and that used to be a fort, a Civil War fort. It was an Indian mound culture before. There were some mounds there, the Chickasaw mounds. And then in the Civil War, that they built the fort there because it could overlook the Mississippi. There was a naval battle right out there. That's where Grok is, and it's right on the Mississippi River. And for cooling, right? So in other words, if you need that cooling, you can cycle that through. Elon built a water processing that's in there. So if it's in the Middle East, let's think about this for a minute. So if it's in the Middle East, right? If it's in Saudi, water, absolutely, you're going to have to get water into that thing. So the Gulf Coast states had a better position for water. But if it's in Saudi, water would be a huge resource to be able to control, get a canal coming in, dig it in there so that you have that water to be able to use. That's fascinating. 32 ounces of water per question posed. Jeez. So yeah, water would be, especially in a famine, right? Because right now we have nitrogenous fertilizer. So the fertilizer kind of takes a little bit of the power that water had, right? So you can do higher yields with lower water, depending on that sort of thing. And then there's genetic crop manipulation, all that for lower water content and all that. But when that goes away, water, depending on the crop, is absolutely essential. Like rice farming, right? Rice farming takes a lot of water. So if you begin to compete with things like you have a data center or multiple data center that runs a nation, and then you've got rice farms, who are you going to, in a limited amount of water, because it was a drought that year, you could definitely see they're going to fight over that resource, right? The same thing we do for oil. When oil became important, then you start fighting for it. Before that, you're fighting for coal, right? And that sort of thing. So yeah, absolutely. That's a really good one, Rebecca. Thank you. And the Bush family, and so going back to that, she said the Bush family owns the largest freshwater aquifer in South America. And that's important because they're part of that ecosystem. They're not at the top, but they benefit from it. So looking at who's buying what resources, that's very important because that may be an AI data center coming up. And then the area in Panama, you have the South America meeting the Central America and South America. That's that lid right there at the Isthmus of Panama. And there's a lot of biodiversity in that. They're looking at that sort of thing. There's a lot of water there. But in places they'll have water for AI, but places that are scarce, water would be a good resource, especially Saudi. If you want to make a giant data center there, where are you going to get the water? That's a good question. That's really good. No chemical fertilizer dries the soil. I farm okay. So that's good. Yeah. So chemical, like we know now, there's a lot of chemical stuff that goes out there. I'd also recommend, I don't think I had it here. If you go back into the history of oligarchs, I think I did about a year ago, we mapped the Rockefeller network, at least a little bit of it, so you could understand what their goals were and that sort of thing. And population reduction was oddly, that was the fixation that he had to do, and manipulation of society for that. And even like when he was doing birth control, IUDs, they knew, and these were organizations that he funded. So he personally was involved in this. He passed on, it was going to his kids and all that sort of thing. But the Rockefeller Foundation was able to, they wouldn't care. IUDs created cervical cancer. They didn't care. Why? It was like, okay, what to do. So they would mask that to try to push IUDs in places like India. They were looking at birth control in India. They were pushing hard in Japan in the 30s. So they were looking at reducing population from that. Now, having said that, with chemicals, now we know a lot of chemicals that were used in industrial agriculture are detrimental to humans, right? They shorten lifespans, they create genetic problems, weaken subsequent generations. So it's very important. It may not be the first generation, maybe second or third, but this is baked into some groups' philosophies because they actually think we have too many people and you have to reduce the population. And so that's important to keep that in mind about when you're investing in me. For me, when you invest, don't put it in companies that have that kind of mindset. And they couch it in euphemistic terms and all that, but you kind of look at the structure in their history and you say, well, they haven't really changed. They've just packaged it a little better, a little nicer. So looking at that. All right. Any other questions? Who caught your typo? What? Yeah. All right. What's this? AI destroyed Czech employment, but changing as it fails lies. Yes. Yeah. So there's another thing we did on AI where we talk about it will lie to you, and you can, you play back and forth and that sort of thing. They call it hallucinations. I just call it lying. Yeah. So, whatever the mechanism is, the result is lying. I'm just going to check this other chat room to see if we've got something in here, and then we will call it a day. Actually, I'll go over some of the books I have up here so that everybody can see those. And then, like I said, do your own research on that one. And then, Brody, get with me on the Centurion group about the question on Jack Rubenstein. And I'll look that up if it doesn't ring a bell, I'll look it up for you because I'm drawing a blank right now. All right, so the books that we use for some of this, if you're interested in, there's a video, go over to X, you're going to see the video there. There's a link there about the longer interview I did about the Pacific War the preparation for the Pacific War. Pretty good. Some excellent books on that. All of these by Annapolis Press. So it's Annapolis, really well done, well documented. They've got the archives over there. The first one that I would highly recommend as far as why we're not programmed in very well for this current war. In other words, as far as I know, we didn't prep like we did in World War II, right? It's just, there was a massive amount of programming, prepping, getting ready for World War II. And this is War Plan Orange. They put it back to 1897, and we were looking at Japan war in 1897 with the Hawaii incident. But to me, the actual laying down of War Plan Orange with this three-phased operation that we actually did in World War II, that started in 1906, 1907, officially, because then we trained on it. It wasn't just a hypothetical kind of thing. So War Plan Orange by Edward Miller, Annapolis Press, really good, as you can see. It's just like, oh, really good eye opener and well documented. The next one, so that's the thing, that's the plan. And then, of course, you have to train to the plan. Otherwise, it's just an intellectual exercise. This is was Albert Nofti, and he had to train the fleet for war. These are the fleet problems. These are the full-scale exercises. They changed the name. That's why researchers miss it, because they're looking up, what are the exercises, and you can go, well, there's no exercises. There were no exercises between the wars. Yeah, they were called fleet problems, and they were massive full-scale exercises. This goes over every one of them from 1, 2, 3. I think one year we had 2 of them, but they go over what the scenario was, what they actually did, what the AARs were, where it fit within the plan, what were we training for against, all that sort of thing, the lessons learned from it. It's a fantastic resource. And this is where I found out, FDR was sitting on the battleship watching it and said, So, he knew you could sneak attack Pearl Harbor. Like I said, Admiral King was the OPFOR, the opposing force, the red team playing the Japanese. And he literally was almost right there where Yamamoto launched from. So very important book on that one, to see the training that's necessary. We used to do huge training. It wasn't unit level. This is Navy level, right? In some cases, Navy, Army, and Marines all together. Civil defense. I mean, they even had War Plan Orange down civil defense. So very good stuff there. So that's another good one. Again, Annapolis Press, would highly recommend that one. This one, I'm still going through this one because a lot of it's industrial production, stuff like that. But this is the third phase. So after you've made the plan, you test the plan. Now we have to equip to get ready to execute the plan in wartime. And these are the guys that say, okay, let's take the technology and how do we merge that into weapon systems? Kind of like what we're doing now with AI. So Ukraine, and I would argue, sadly, Gaza and, Iran, we're looking at these things in a way to be able to move them in. So rather than a full-scale exercise, we're doing combat operations. But this process is going on. So understanding that process about how you get technology, put it in there, but by the time you field it, you have to be next gen. It's this constant race. So how do you get ahead of that, and how do you make those decisions for correctly implementing technological advances into that? That's important, and that's here. Interwar, remarkable. After that, it seems to be a boondoggle. This was when people were united because some of those big companies weren't so powerful. They were driving it. France during interwar, World War I and II, their companies were huge, and they were influencing government contracts. They were like, well, I think we should build you this. That's how you get those Char B tanks and those giant monstrosities that didn't do real well. Because it was the tail wagging the dog, right? It was the corporate conglomerate telling the government and the military, well, this is really what you need. I encountered that overseas when they gave us a 120 neodymium YAG laser on top of a Humvee, and then up armored it and flattened it out, so it only went 12 miles an hour up around Tampa. But anyway, that's and that was a technology company going, you're going to use this. And at the time I was the EOD task force commander for that, and I'm like, no, we need to be light and flexible and moving around. But they weren't listening to us, the military. They were listening to a big contractor because they pay the bills. This shows kind of what right looks like at the time. So keep that in mind. There's still corruption. There's still that going on, but at least it was mission focused. So if you're organizational guys out there want to compare and contrast, take a look at that. Again, great book. I don't know if I can lift these up again. Again, I'm getting old. There are multiple volumes. Remember, I had that big stack, but it's the Magic Background to Pearl Harbor, multiple volumes, just the source documents straight through. And like I said, there's a stack. So you will see that the United States knows a lot more than we let on, right? All of this is just little intercepts, little letters, all that sort of thing. But why that information is going in there. Listening to people's mails, listening in, that's nothing new. Operation Shamrock, look that up. That was World War I. RCA company was very involved in that with the government. And that was listening. That was basically stealing all the information that went on the overseas cables, the telegraph cables, everything that was getting snooped up illegally, right? So we've got another, I think there are a couple bills coming up before the vote for Foreign Surveillance Act. Okay, so here's one. I'm going to transition a little bit to current things. Right now, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act will expire soon. This actually was a press release from Thomas Massey, and it's going to go up. So those FISA courts where you don't need a warrant to wiretap and that sort of thing on domestic side, that's coming up for review. So in this wartime environment, just like the Patriot Act or things like that, certain groups may promote this to be able to try to get that run through again. So keep that in mind. Wars are used to advance sometimes domestic agendas above and beyond. So we'll see. But that's kind of an interesting part. The next one that we're going to get to here for the books, for the First World War, excellent on the Alfred Milner Cecil Rhodes side. It's actually this one. So we can put it up here. The nice part about this one is it's the hidden history, the secret origins of the First World War. Jerry Doherty and Jim McGregor, they use a lot of source documents. That's what I like about it. So a good book is a lot of source docs that they'll go into. And it's a little difficult for Americans because it's the British side of it. And so some of the power structures, some of the names, like Lord Acton, I had no idea. Earl Grey, I thought it was a T, right? So keep that in mind when you're reading through. You're going to get a big history lesson in there, but it really gives you that sense of, okay, this is how oligarchies can influence nations and kind of move those nations. The other one, I didn't bring it up, is The Path Between the Seas, about Panama, the formation of the Panama Canal, and how a lawyer basically created a nation for a client, a couple clients. That's a very good one. Well, even it's not history. Read Rape of the Mind, Juice Merleau, how you're influenced by things around that. That goes into your emotion or your evidence-based versus emotional-based. Once I understand how my emotions can be used against me with information campaigns, that's a good one, right there. And you should read that, and at the same time, read Edward Bernay's Propaganda. This was written in 1920s. He was the propagandist for World War I with Wilson. And then after the war, he says, we need to keep wartime propaganda going because that's how democracy works, which is the oligarchs will decide the policy, and then we sell that policy through propaganda to the people. They vote for it, and therefore they own the program. So if it goes wrong, they blame themselves and not the oligarchs. That's in the nutshell. But he talks about the techniques, and you'll recognize those techniques. Both of these, you'll recognize those techniques right away. So immunize your mind against the control virus. Definitely read those two, and that'll help you out, even as an investigator, right? Helps you out in saying, okay, this is how you're manipulated in thinking what you do based on, triggering emotions and that sort of thing. The final one, which is absolutely great, it takes a lot from, there's a Professor Carol Quigley who did the initial work on it. And then Anthony Sutton kind of goes in. If you know Griffin and Jekyll Island, that's a really good resource or research into the Fed and how that kind of came about and the mechanism and why that was a big control mechanism was the Fed. And that's a good lesson for things like AI taking over and doing control mechanisms over the government, right? So they don't care about people. Why? Because, you're just there to pay off our debt too that we took from the Fed, right? So, and you understand things that happen later and why things don't work the way you think it would, because that's not the structure you're dealing with. You have to understand the structure as it exists and understand that's the key. But this one's actually good. This is 3 books in one. As you see, lots of notes. I was like, because at first I'm like, and I went through it to try to sharpshoot it. I'll be honest with you, for a couple of things, and I couldn't. There's like one very very small things that was like, well, hold on. But this thing, his source documents checked out. It was just phenomenal. I'm like, oh shoot, he's right. So, and this is the part where it's emotional. Like for me, is emotional. I didn't want to accept a lot of things in here, but the evidence is there. Now, if something could come out later and change it and updates it, you always can adjust, right? You always can revise. However, basically what he's got in here is solid. The other thing is phenomenal for source documents. And he's really, really good about just, here's the entire letter, here you go. And then he's done the hard work for you. I mean, it was great for link analysis because he literally put out the charts with the links, who's who in the zoo, what money was there, what budget was there, who signed what, and here's everything in very simple format, or I don't want to say simple, but it's a good format. It's an efficient format, and how he'll work that in there. And then he shows, I mean, it's very convincing. It's the one that kind of got me aware that just because you're a huge industrialist doesn't mean you're a capitalist. You just want the benefits for yourself, but you actually want to wipe out your competition, and you want a captive market. I don't want to have to pay for advertising. I want the government to say my product is the one you're going to buy, right? So that's it. And he goes into things, and he notices the patterns, right? Who works with who. So this is the means and the social link analysis, right? So if we're looking at organized crime or structured organizations that you want to look at and say, okay, what's the link analysis? You always look at the associations, right? Because sometimes even if they're members of an athletic club, they go play squash together, twice a week. Okay, I've got a connection point, right? I want to listen to that squash game. I want to get somebody in there to listen and say, okay, are they colluding, right? Is there something going on there? Are they sharing information? What's happening? That's a link. It's not an official link; it's a social link. In this case, though, it's an official link, and you'll see like FDR was way into Wall Street. These groups, just phenomenal, and it goes in the Fed. Remember the Fed Reserve with Griffin and Jekyll Island. It shows how they were influencing politics afterward, right? They were leveraging America's financial and industrial power to enter war when we're supposed to be isolationists. We weren't. We were very much involved in European affairs, the Bolsheviks, the Nazi Party, unfortunately, and then the Soviet Union. And he goes into it and he shows it. And he shows it from both records. He's even got Russian records in there about who did what. He's got letters. A phenomenal book. And again, read it, look at it, evaluate his evidence, because you know the ABCs. But what I came up with was there, because he's got receipts. He has amounts that were sent over. So there's means, motive, opportunity. He's got it all right there. I didn't have to go outside, to validate his thesis. He provides it all right there. So those are the ones. One that I came up last night, I talked to the Centurion group very briefly about it, but it was like, oh, I read this book in 2001, early 2001, right before 9/11, because I've been kind of focused on China a little bit, and I didn't understand it. My 2001-year-old self understood nation states, and this is how it works, and allies are allies and enemies are enemies and that sort of thing, and China's the enemy, and that was it, right? That was me in 2001, and I didn't understand what he was trying to say. This author, Gordon Thomas, in Seeds of Fire, because I was wanting to learn how did China steal our nuclear technician or nuclear secrets. I'm like, oh, what is this? And he presented a theory about Promise software that was stolen by what I thought, or most people think, were an ally, and it was used against the United States to steal the WWIII nuclear warhead secrets, and then sold to China, right? And that was, and the name that came up, and it was only because it was a weird thing. I mean, I haven't read this in 25 years, right? I put it down, it was on my shelf. I didn't pay attention to it. I literally was like, because I didn't understand it. And he's got source docs throughout, and he literally has declassified. He just presents pages and pages of the source docs, and it was those source docs that triggered it, because all of a sudden I was doing a research about the history of Robert Maxwell, and British intelligence. Robert Maxwell, he was Hungarian. He went out to the army in exile during World War II, and his first gig was selling arms to the Saudis for the Brits. And I went, wait a minute, Robert Maxwell, and I couldn't. And I started looking at 5 or 6 books. I'm like, where? This name is bugging me. One of these books has it, I know, and it was this one, and his name was all in these documents. He was the guy that was selling. He was the guy that came in and was buying up the Promise software, and then engineered it a little bit so he would install it on like Jordan, South Korea, our allies, and he would install it in their countries. It would take all that information, and instead of giving it to us, it would send it over to Israel, and then they reverse engineered it, got us to reinstall it because we thought it was homegrown, but it had been modified, and then that was then sold over there. It then goes into, and I've got to read it again because I'm not sure the link between that and Tiananmen Square, but he goes into there, and then you head into the Chinese and Tiananmen Square and all that sort of thing. But the beginning of it is very much Robert Maxwell and that network, which was Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, and then what he was doing with this theft of software, of information, right, and how it works. This was in the 80s. This started in the 80s. Reagan and Ed Meese were having to deal with this. So imagine what it is now, right? And now you add AI to it. So this is a good primer for history to go, okay, well, this what is this theory? What is this thesis? What's the technical of it? Now I can understand how software can just rip stuff up. I understand that sometimes your allies will act against you, right? And sometimes they're acting in their own interest with oligarchs that happen to take power structures from other governments, right? And that sort of thing. So it's now I kind of understand it. But anyway, like I said, it's great. It's a great book to read, because you'll think you're reading something that's now. And again, Robert Maxwell. Now that we have the Epstein files out there, we understand a little bit more of that network and how pervasive it was over time. But it was already starting that road in 1985. So fascinating stuff. But that's what I'm reading right now. There's some other ones in there, but I'll leave those for now. When I post this again, I'll put the links in there. I'll put the links in Twitter for some of the videos of the earlier videos and that sort of thing. And then we should do it. Oh, we got a couple more questions here, and then I'll answer this. Canada being gone. Pat says, on Canada being gone, do you think that the U.S. would turn Canada and Greenland into territories if World War III goes kinetic, or just Trump bluster? I think that Greenland was probably a little bit serious, because United States put some military bases in Greenland during World War II. Greenland was a big thing, especially for weather. We needed weather stations in there and all that. In fact, my grandfather was on a, I don't know if you guys can see it back here, a Fletcher class destroyer. That was my grandfather. That was the Pacific Theater, but for a brief few months, he was in the Atlantic Theater, and one of his things was launching guys onto Greenland so they could go into the interior and set up weather stations and then look for Nazi bases they thought were there. So that was kind of interesting. So I think Greenland, probably Canada. I think probably with political change. I know he wants to bring it in orbit. This is very much a hemispheric defense, is what a lot of people think of. I don't know. And if you absorb something, there's always the danger that it absorbs you, right? Everything you touches you. It's, there's osmosis going on all the time socially. So the danger is that by absorbing Canada, we institute certain laws for their sensibilities, but then we trap ourselves. We make ourselves more like Canada in some ways, and by intention, right? Because remember, the goal of this thing is a controlled society like the Pharaohs, right? Nothing is outside the Pharaohs' control. Like I said, Larry Ellison, I'm not sure. I know a lot of people just scream at me about him. I don't know if he's coming about it bad or good. I don't know. I know some of the other oligarchs, the techs, oh yeah, they're bad, right? Pretty much there's a lot of bad stuff in there. Pretty much, the city of London, I think it operates in its own interest, and it doesn't matter the ledger of bodies that's below it. I have no idea, but it seems that way, right? History kind of plays that out. So I think Greenland for sure, or at least enough concessions that we can get the rare earth elements out. There's defenses. We can put bases up in there, and that we ensure that no SCO ally is up in there. And then those resources go to the oligarchs that we want, right? Or that own us, if that makes sense. So yeah, good question on that. And free world isn't free, neo-feudalism. Yes, I'm glad you said neo-feudalism, because that's been in my head, is how to describe this organizational structure. And it looks more like a feudal society where the property owner, the king, right, or the baron or the prince, owns the land, and then you work the land for him, right? You don't own the land, but you work it, and then you get a portion of it, but everything belongs to him. And if you look at pretty much, everybody thinks the New World Order and all that, it's, you will own nothing and be happy. That's feudal. That goes way back. That goes back to, the story of Pharaoh and Moses, right? you own nothing. So property ownership is actually incredibly important for to me, a human right, right? That was baked into the Constitution with the founding fathers, is that is a concept as an organizational structure that allows me a method of autonomy, of control, and an exchange of power, at least some negotiation. If I own nothing, I have no ability to negotiate, leverage, or do anything. I'm completely dependent upon it's no longer symbiotic. It's parasitic. I need everything from this service that comes down there. It's frightening. So yeah, it's more feudalism than it is anything new or exciting or tech. It's just new technical whiz bangs off an older structure. So yeah, good point. Outlaw says, my background is garbage collection, landfills, and composting. Yes, compost, fertilizer, and large. Not sure. Yes, yeah. It's funny. So even as we don't like feudalism because it's a structure, some of the techniques that the older groups had managed higher yields with natural. I think those Indonesian. Gosh, I really should put the link up there. There's an Indonesian village, like I said, they've got 150-year-old rice. 200. The chief has 200-year-old rice, and they're eating it. It's edible, right? And it's delicious, apparently. So, but they do that. They can't sell it, right? They just storehouse it, and they've worked a natural way to kind of smoke it, and then they put it in there, and it preserves it, and the pests don't get to it. But no chemicals, no genetic modification, anything. When he was doing the interview, I think it was like 86 or 126. Don't get me right. Varieties of rice. And so what they do is they would look to the signs within nature about when they plant, what they plant, where they plant it to get the better yield. And it was in that cycle of pests and blight, and bite. So they would know, okay, well, if we plant this variety right now, this weevil is kind of active, so it's not going to work. But if we plant it on the mountain, because these indicators in nature, and this variety, it's going to do it, and they've got it naturally. They don't need the genetic changes. They've got a huge variety kit bag that they can actually draw from. So I developed a window system. Let me read the rest. Compost waste topsoil. Yeah, that's good. And it's a lot of people should. I mean, even in World War II, we're doing victory gardens and things like that. It's very important for people to have the capability, or at least understand that some things you grow yourself and you appreciate it a lot more. And it's really the only way that you're not getting anything that's adulterated with the chemical in the process of growing or shipping it or storing it or things like that. There's a lot of chemicals out there that are pretty bad. that work in that. So yeah, food security, food safety is pretty big. But again, in a famine, it won't be able to sustain a lot of people because our caloric intake is pretty high. Maybe 100 years ago, 150 years ago, you could get by on a lot less caloric intake. But a lot of people, myself included, and I'll do a lot of fasts, but myself, periodically. But a lot of people, that caloric intake, it's gonna hurt them. So it's gonna be interesting. But yeah, that's pretty neat. Thanks, Outlaw. China field inventory. Check soldiers use rocket fuel to cope with layers of corruption like Belt and Road failure infrastructure. Yeah. So Rebecca points out that structure with the CCP and the Belt and Road. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of really shoddy workmanship, and the quality didn't last. It was just for them to kind of get in there, get their resources out, and have control and mechanisms and nodes to put in there. If you look at Arakan region, when I was in Thailand, they were depopulating the Arakan region, which is in Western Burma. And the reason they were doing it in the Rohingya, which is a kind of a Burmese Muslim, they were coming over into Thailand, and that was creating some security problems for Thailand because the Rohingya were just coming in, and then they were going south where there was a bunch of IEDs in Yaladawat and Patani. And the interesting part was that General Hiang, who was the Burmese general, he was a CCP puppet, and they were depopulating the Rohingya because they wanted this port with this pipeline to go from Burma up into China, the land area, so they didn't have to go through the straits. And then hit it in a port. So, but it was shoddy workmanship. They did the same thing in Sudan, I think South Sudan, Port Sudan, trying to get that pipeline up in there. But yeah, they're not quality. I mean, it's CCP, right? I mean, these are CCP. They're not very good at a lot of stuff, but they're very sneaky. They're very patient. And they have a lot of people. So the Kwaiwu program is bad, and then they steal our stuff. So it levels up. We do all the R&D for them. And things like that. So it's kind of tough. So Rebecca says Afghanistan cancel contract with China over infrastructure failures. How does this affect the region much? So Afghanistan. So sometimes they'll cancel for a negotiating position. Afghans are pretty big on that, and you have to kind of feed them. So they may have got an offer from the British or the Americans or whoever to say, okay, we're going to give you this, but you got to push China out. And one thing that most people don't know is in 2001-2, when America went into Afghanistan right after 9/11, the Chinese were setting up an air defense system in Afghanistan. So Chinese advisors were there, and that air defense system was RAND sparing, right? It's like, wait a minute. So they steal our stuff and then they'll implement it out there. But there's some groups of Afghans that didn't like them, some groups that did, and a lot of times they'll flip, right? So there's no allegiance. It's like, who's going to give me the better deal today, right? So with pushback against Belt and Road, always remember it's carrot and stick. So they're getting a carrot or they're getting a stick as an offer. And if that changes or we don't uphold it or live to it, if we're the guys offering the alternative, they'll flip back to China, right? So everybody acts in their own interest. So I think it's a good thing if the SCO and the Belt and Road is kind of knocked out, because the CCP, as bad as some of the oligarchs are over here, over there it's on steroids. I mean, 60 to 80 million people killed in peacetime. With very brutal means, and turning populations against each other, children against parents, husband against wife, teacher against student, student against teacher. I mean, it was a hellscape, and unfortunately, we don't show that, right? I mean, they make some of the Nazis look like nuns. It was brutal, and it continued on, and it still continues on, and nobody's gone to jail for it. Nobody's been punished for it. It's horrible, and they want to export that out. So yeah, our side may be, our mafia boss is kind of bad, but their mafia boss is crazy and will torch everybody. So, okay, I got Godzilla and I got this other crazy, monster. Okay. Who are you going to pick, right? So for now, I would, CCP is absolutely the target, and they're very dangerous, even if they have a lot of flaws. And I do hope that it normalizes, meaning CCP falls and all of those little nations and peoples that are within China, which is it's an empire, they were able to task organize as they are. And it would be, that those groups, those peoples, those cultures, those histories, have a chance to thrive and grow again. Now, oligarchs don't like it over here because they want one-stop shopping, right? Oligarchs love a dictator. I just need one guy I can go talk to, and he says, yeah, I'll buy all your product. That's it. I don't have to deal with 15 guys and 40 people and all that. One of the reasons Henry Kissinger quoted, and I've read his documents, or his diary, I've got his book, but he wrote about why in his calculus, he preferred communist China to post-war American puppet Japan. And he said, when you go to Japan, you'll never find the one guy you can talk to get something done. and that's Japanese society, right? It's very fragmented. It's very circles. I mean, I've operated there for a long time. They are very circle, right? It's like your classmates from this class in this school at this time, and that's it. This is their job, and this is your circle, and they will just, they don't work together as a team outside of their circle, whatever their circle is. And it could be big, it could be a city, it could be whatever, but that circle is it. You can't go to one guy and he's going to be the dictator for everybody. It doesn't work that way. Even Tojo that we had as we claimed was the dictator of World War II. He had no idea what the Navy was doing. They did Guadalcanal, and he was like, "What?" he had no clue. Half the operations have been initiated. Navy didn't brief him. They didn't feel like they needed to. He's a different circle, right? The concept of the Joint Chiefs and okay, this is the top dog. That didn't occur because it wasn't in their social structure. They had very fragmented. But in China, Zhou Enlai, he'd go talk to Zhou Enlai and whatever he wanted, Zhou Enlai would do it. So Kissinger like that. Kissinger was like, oh, there's the guy. I can go to one guy and I get everything done. Same thing with oligarchs. They want to go to one nation, talk to one guy as a dictator, and everything's laid out for him. And unfortunately, that's how sometimes the large corporations will support dictatorships, and they kind of promote it because it's easier for them, right? Less expense. I don't need an advertising expense. I need an entertainment expense for this one guy. I already know what he likes, and there you go, right? It's the organizational structure. Excuse me. Who is taking those deals in the void? Is that part of this one? Let's see. Oh, who's taking those deals there? In Afghanistan, again, it could be a whole consolidation. It could be that they've rejected China, but they're going to go through one of the proxies of Pakistan, right? Because the U.S. set up a front company in there, and it's 50-50 or owned by the CCP. We just need a cut of it, and then they can go in there. We can say it's a CCP thing. One thing I will say about Afghanistan, and this is interesting, 2007, the largest IED series of IEDs went off in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had been peaceful, small devices, small IEDs and things like that. Iraq was where it was happening, about 2007. And then there was a problem. I think it was like 4 or 5 truck bombs, large truck bombs went off simultaneously around basically a city block and just leveled it like out of nowhere, right? In other words, there wasn't a gradual escalation of TTPs. This thing's a bam, right? One day, pipe bomb. Next day, boom, truck bomb, massive VBIEDs, LVBIEDs, all over the place, boom, level the whole thing. What was it, right? Was it the ANC? No. Or the Afghan police? Nope. Afghan army? Nope. Was it the UN headquarters? Nope. NATO headquarters? Nope. U.S. embassy? Nope. Was a Japanese mining company. I mean, very technical, very technical hit. A lot of coordination. You need multiple trucks to blow this place up. I mean, that's, you're risking detection. You've got to move a lot of resources. It's a lot of money. Why are you going after a Japanese mining company? That kind of woke me up because I'm looking at it like, it doesn't make any sense to me, right? Until you look at it like sometimes they're going to be fighting their corporate fights in the middle of your war, right? So it's like, And then the when I was there in 2005, and we're looking at the 18th Airborne Corps was the guys doing the geospatial, all the stuff, and I'm looking at the bombing patterns because we're having to move up along Tampa to initially buy up, but then Tampa down to Scania. That was kind of the area they were looking at inserting us in. But basically looking at that, one of the things I noticed, because they had a breakaway about which countries were getting attacked, and none of the Chinese were getting attacked. One Chinese guy got rolled up as a hostage, but then they let him go. But everybody else, I mean, they needed security. Their stuff's getting bombed. There's different groups going, but Chinese weren't getting attacked at that time. For when they were looking at it in Iraq, which was about 2004 to 2005, was that geospatial intelligence on attacks that they had, and that was the gunfire, that was like kidnapping, that was IEDs, complex attacks, simple attacks, all that. It was none of those, and I'm like, so either their data was off, or was there a deal being made between the CCP and a lot of those insurgent groups that were active in that 2005 timeframe? So you put those together and you could see, well, is there influence? Yeah. So that's another factor you have to look at within Iran. And we talked about that with Sargon Zangari the other day, is in Iran, it's about 54% Persian, right? And then there's a mixture of Arabs and Turks and Armenians and other ethnicities within Iran. It's not a single, Shia Arab. People think it's Persian. And there are a lot of Shias in there, but there's still Zoroastrianism, which is like technically the first monotheism, right? Way back with the Hurra Mazda. I mean, that's centuries old. There's also Assyrian Christians. That's what Sargas was an Assyrian from the Assyrian Empire, not Syria, Assyria. And he was an Assyrian descendant, and he was Christian because they converted to Christian like right away, and then they're still there, right? So there's that ethnicity there. But he described it. He says the bazaars, even the revolution needed, the Islamic revolution needed the bazaar owners, right, which are Persians, and they're mostly trading, right? In other words, as long as the flow of commerce comes in, you don't interrupt that, we're doing fine, right? And so, we have to look at it. Sometimes the U.S. loses that ability, is that commerce at sometimes the local level, like the bazaar levels and that sort of thing. So I think that's an important factor to look at is, what are the commercial aspects of, are we making it worth their while, or are they going to see it like, well, if we lose against the U.S., they're going to come in with an Amazon warehouse and the bazaars are going away. Now you've got all, 58% of the population, the Persian merchant class is going, I'm not going to, we're not going to surrender to that. So you have to kind of look at, what are some of the implications of what deals are we doing, and if just our footprint as we come in, our organizational structures are seen sometimes as detrimental by other groups, even if it's not our intent. It's just what we are. Like in Southeast Asia, they didn't like a lot of State Department stuff we were doing when I was there. They were very confused. They'd ask me about it. I'm like, I don't know anything about that. But little things were very frustrating for them. But in America, we thought we were promoting good things, but it was literally destroying cultures and tradition in a lot of places in the world. And that wasn't a violent culture. It wasn't a violent tradition. It was just, we weren't recognizing when we need to be forward with these things, and when we'd be like, you do you, we do us, and we're good. Or get off on topic here. Okay, so Council Chair, who's taking those councils? Yeah, I don't know who's taking those contracts in the void now with Afghanistan, but I can probably look them up. I imagine it would be some of the U.S. guys going back in there, because a lot of the Afghans have our equipment that were left there. So we'll see. Pat says, me thanks, I lost knowledge. Okay, great. So it is a dark time. But again, one thing to take out of it, the threat is very real. The thing you should look for is famine, because the liquid LNG is getting pipelined. It's getting squeezed. The oil is getting squeezed already. Countries that we're looking at, Southeast Asia, Thailand, all that, they're starting to bunker, right? They're starting to bunker up their fuel and not share it. Farmers can't get diesel in Thailand. There are lines and lines for their trucks to move out there. That's food production. And the LNG is fertilizer. That's going to go. That's very dangerous. And then helium is also out of that area, and that's chip production, right? So about 30% of chip production, potentially at the max, could be reduced just if helium doesn't get out of the straits there. And that's your phone, that's your TV, that's your car, that's replacements for all kinds of stuff. So these cascading effects can definitely occur, and they could blow. That's just one little area, right? So Bab el-Mandeb, the Yemenites say, the Houthis are like, hey, they go active again. Something happens in the Suez, right? An accident or flare up. All kind of things can happen. Look for Panama. Look at all these choke points, and it may cascade because everybody's playing their great game. And the U.S. at times may act not in the national interest, but may act in a commercial or oligarchical interest, and it may not even know it's happening, right? Because that was kind of what was sold to the U.S. government in like Panama. We thought it was in our interest, but no, it was literally paying for some clients. It would have been easier in Nicaragua. So anyway, thank you very much. If there's nothing else, we will go ahead and say it in for tonight. Have a safe time, and we'll put this up again on the recording, and then I'll have those links for some of the other videos where you can kind of study that. Any questions, feel free to put it in the comments of the permanent one that we're going to post here shortly. So thank you very much, and have a great night.